Chapter 1374. The moment this figure appeared, the 666 pseudo-saint-grade cultivators let out blood-curdling screams. Amidst the screams, the aura around them seemed to have been added to a pile of firewood, and it became even more powerful. The incomparably powerful aura overlapped and gradually formed a strange aura world. Although this aura world wasn't very vast, it was more condensed and tyrannical. In this world, even the rules and laws of the Devil Realm and the great Tao of the Devil Realm were repelled. Previously, these pseudo-saint-grade cultivators had been like ants to Yuan venerates, Hao Zun, and the level 9 pseudo-saint-grade cultivators of the mystic Yang sky. They had been bullied, and plotted against by Yuan venerates, Hao Zun, and the level 9 pseudo-saint-grade cultivators of the mystic Yang sky. In fact, a pseudo-saint-grade cultivator, even a small level 1 pseudo-saint-grade cultivator, was enough to suppress the sky and earth and cause shocking damage to the demon realm. Now that the power of these 666 pseudo-saint-grade cultivators had been stimulated, the power that they could conjure was much stronger than usual. One could imagine how strong the effect was. It was normal for such an aura realm to be formed. Luo Fan, Yuan Liangzi, and the others hurriedly retreated when they saw this scene. Although this aura realm didn't affect them, it was gradually expanding, and they might be swallowed at any time. Given their strength, they would definitely be in trouble if they were swallowed, even if they wouldn't be completely digested by the realm immediately. At that moment, Hao Zun suddenly appeared on the auspicious cloud above them and smiled. "This is the holy decree." Yuan Liangzi and the others were shocked when they saw Hao Zun suddenly appear. Luo Fan was bewildered, but he didn't want to keep a low profile anymore. Instead, he asked directly, how could such a holy decree appear? Even a level 9 venerate would need to break through to the sage realm to condense a strand of holy decree. One has to break through to the sage realm in order to condense a trace of it. There isn't even a level 9 fake sage in this array. How could there be such a powerful holy decree? Hao Zun acted as if he didn't know that Luo Fan's words meant that he wasn't simple. He smiled and said, "What's impossible about that? If he couldn't condense the holy will, what kind of formation do you think is worth me spending 666 level 8 pseudo-sage treasures to set up? This clearly doesn't conform to the principles of cultivation." Cultivation principles. What were cultivation principles? Let me tell you what the true essence of cultivation is. In fact, the Khanate Grand Luo realm was already the highest realm beneath the Saint realm. After that, there were 5 stages of quasi-saint and 9 stages of false saint. Due to the huge gap between the innate Grand Luo and the Sage realm, there were some realms above the innate Grand Luo. Strictly speaking, these 14 realms could be considered quasi-sages. Or perhaps he was just a fake saint. Since it was a realm. Who said that only 9th level venerables could attack the saint realm and condense the holy decree? Who said that you guys are fake saints with lower realms? No chance of becoming a saint? As he spoke, Hao Zun turned to look at Yuan Liangzi and the rest, whose expressions changed, and continued, "Are you feeling excited?" He felt that he had cleared the fog and that his future had become extremely bright. "Do you think that you've caught the tail of the saint realm?" His words were strange, causing the expressions of Yuan Liangzi and the rest to change slightly, except for Luo Fan. Apart from Luo Fan, who had thought about this a long time ago and did not think as Hao Zun said, everyone else was shocked. Just as Hao Zun had said, Yuan Liangzi and the rest were stirred up by Hao Zun's words and felt excited. They felt that they had caught the truth of cultivation and that the distance between them and the saint realm was not that far away anymore. Now that Hao Zun had said that, they had a bad feeling. They felt that what Hao Zun was going to say next was going to kick them into a bottomless abyss, just like their excitement. Ha! Hao Zun laughed out loud. As he laughed aloud, the formation composed of the 666 pseudo-sage sages had been activated to the extreme. Because their auras had reached the peak, the world of auras became like a real world. A world that was embedded into the demon realm was formed in the void, completely covering the boundless sea area below, making this place look like the boundary between the demon realm and other worlds. Translator, Zephizi Editor. Dio Quinn as he laughed out loud. The formation of the 666 pseudo-sage sages had been activated to the extreme. Amidst the aura, the figure that looked like Hao Zun and had a holy will condensed by the formation had taken on a real appearance. The eternal and indestructible aura on his body was so strong that it was almost visible to the naked eye. Everyone seemed to have seen the embryonic form of a saint at this moment. The 666 cultivators were reduced to skin and bones. Even their origin of life and their vitality were almost completely drained. Only a tiny bit of origin of life remained in the depths of their divine souls, faintly swaying as a sign to the outside world that they were still alive. This tragic state was many times worse than when their energy had been sucked dry by the Yuan Venerate. Back when their energy had been sucked dry by the Yuan Venerate to set up the array formation, even though their vitality and life source had been sucked dry, it hadn't been a one-off extraction. Instead, there had been room for them to recover so that they could at least recover through cultivation after leaving that state. However, this time, the vitality and life source that had been sucked dry weren't the same as the Yuan Venerates. They were the target of the extraction. The depletion of their vitality and life source was the result of a deeper form of depletion. In other words, what these fake saints had lost was many times more precious than the life source and vitality on the surface. Yuan Liangzi and the others, as well as Luo Fan, couldn't help but get goosebumps when they saw the changes in everyone. They understood that these pseudo-sages were most likely crippled. Even if they managed to escape with their lives, they would not be able to survive. Even if they managed to escape with their lives, it would be difficult for them to recover their current cultivation in the future. In fact, it was very likely that they wouldn't even be able to enter the pseudo-saint level again. Hao Zun didn't care about those cultivators. He didn't even glance at them. He laughed heartily and said to Yuan Liangzi and the others, "If you really think as I said, then you are gravely mistaken." The Yuan Venerate seemed a little proud and a little crazy. It's precisely because these 14 cultivation realms belong to the Xiantian Zenith Luo realm that it's even more despairing. The gap between the Xiantian Zenith Luo realm and the Sage realm was infinite. Therefore, even if the 14 cultivation realms were divided, it would still be impossible to overcome the infinite gap between them. Seriously speaking, even 140 cultivation realms, 1,400 cultivation realms, or even 14,000 cultivation realms that were divided into these 14 realms wouldn't be able to close the gap. If anyone can break through to the Sage realm, it means that no one is qualified to break through to the Sage realm. Now, do you still have confidence? Ha ha ha. Hao Zun's words. If it had been said by an ordinary person, Yuan Liangzi and the others would have thought that it was just nonsense. However, it had come from the mouth of a powerful level 9 pseudo-saint level venerate. To them, it was impossible for them to take it lightly. All of a sudden, Yuan Liangzi and the others felt the same intense despair as before. If even a level 9 venerate was so desperate about becoming a sage, what was the point of cultivators like them who were still a long way from becoming a level 9 pseudo-saint level cultivator? For a moment they were at a loss. It was to the extent that even their auras became slightly unstable. As they fluctuated, they even shook the surrounding space-time, causing it to distort. There were even many bolts of lightning flashing within the space-time, destroying everything within it. Of course, these thunderbolts didn't affect Luo Fan and the others at all. Even level 1 pseudo-saint level cultivators couldn't be affected by any natural thunderbolts, let alone Luo Fan, who was already a level 4 pseudo-saint level cultivator. These thunderbolts were millions of times denser than before, so it was just like taking a shower of thunderbolts for them. Hao Zun didn't care about Yuan Liangzi and the others at all. Of course, he didn't say all this just to give them pointers. He was just venting his emotions. Why would he care about what they thought? He pointed at the 666 pseudo-saint level cultivators who had turned into skin and bones and said with a smile, "Do you want to know what was taken from them to turn them into this?" Yuan Liangzi and the others nodded instinctively. Hao Zun smiled again and said, "What was taken from them was the cultivation essence that simulated the holy decree that they formed after breaking through to the innate grand luo. It is precisely because their cultivation essences are combined together that they are able to condense that holy decree." These words finally made the complexion of Luo Fan, who had always been calm, change greatly. He finally knew the true essence of this formation. Just like what Zun Hao had said before, the 14 levels after the innate Grand Luo realm were created to close the gap between the innate Grand Luo realm and the Saint realm due to the huge gap between them. Therefore, to put it another way, these 14 realms were actually a process of proving one's Tao and becoming a sage. The cultivation of these 14 realms was a concrete process of constantly transforming oneself into a sage. However, this transformation seemed to be just the beginning, even when one reached the level 9 pseudo-saint level, which was the last realm of the 14 realms. It was unable to truly achieve the goal of becoming a sage. However, this was a process of getting closer to a sage after all. The cultivation essence of the entire process was naturally to gradually simulate a sage. Under normal circumstances, this kind of simulation was abstract and difficult to detect. The benefits it brought were also contained in one's cultivation and could not be detected. However, if one could extract this abstract simulation, suppress the other aspects and extract one of them, one would naturally be able to obtain a simulated holy decree. It was obviously not strange for several simulated holy decrees to be condensed together to give birth to a holy decree. The formation that Hao Zun had set up was to condense this abstract cultivation essence and convert it into a holy decree to augment the figure that was condensed from infinite power. From then on, the figure would have the terrifying power of a level 9 pseudo-saint level cultivator who had broken through to the sage state. After understanding the truth, Luo Fan suddenly felt a little lucky. He was glad that he did not escape from the platform directly and did not rush into the passage immediately after escaping Yuan Zun's control. These two holy decrees were hidden in his body. Compared to other cultivators, he was more suitable to set up formations. If he had directly rushed into Hao Zun's hands, he would have been the one lying there now. At this moment, Yuan Liangzi suddenly asked, "After their cultivation essence is extracted, what will happen to them? What will happen to them?" Luo Fan could not help but be impressed when he heard this. He was indeed a level 8 pseudo-saint level after all. He had actually recovered so quickly after suffering such a blow. He turned and cuffed Yuan Liangzi. However, he realized that Yuan Liangzi did not look any different on the surface, but there was an indescribable viciousness hidden between his brows. Obviously, he had not regained his composure because he had seen through Hao Zun's words. He was merely suppressing his viciousness and forcefully maintaining his composure. If he had the chance to explode, the viciousness would definitely be earth-shattering. Hao Zun did not care about Yuan Liangzi's viciousness and smiled. They will naturally not be able to cultivate in the future after losing their cultivation essence. They're next. Unless there was a great opportunity. Otherwise, I'll be stuck at the connate grand heavenly realm for the rest of my life. At this time, Scholar Hong finally opened his mouth. They clearly know this. Are you also willing to set up a formation? Zun Hao smiled and said, "Do you think their wishes will affect me?" Moreover, it wasn't a bad thing even if he stopped at the innate golden immortal realm for his entire life. In any case, he couldn't become a saint. As long as I can live forever, what's the difference between a connate grand luo and a false saint? Yuan Liangzi said coldly, then you. Why did he have to cultivate to the 9th level of the pseudo-divine stage? Why don't you cripple your cultivation and become a connate Grand Luo? As soon as Luo Fan heard this, he knew that his hostility had begun to rise. He sighed and took a step back. Hao Zun turned to look at Yuan Liangzi, the smile on his face slowly disappearing. Looks like I've given you too many misconceptions. As he said this, the aura that was initially hidden on his body began to rise. Gradually, the surrounding space-time began to distort. An aura that was even more powerful, more realistic, and more shocking than the aura of the 666 false saints overlapped faintly filled the surroundings. Such an aura existed in an extremely strange form. It seemed to exist in reality, but it did not have much of an impact on the demon world. At least, it did not have the domineering effect of the 666 false saints' overlapped auras that pushed the surrounding space-time apart, as if it was recreating the world. Instead, it was like a silent nourishment, allowing everyone present to feel its existence and know that they had fallen into it. They could also feel the pressure that was enough to break one's spirit, but they did not really come into contact with anything in the world. Under this aura, Hao Zun seemed to have become extremely tall and powerful in front of everyone. Although he was just standing there quietly, he was like a demonic god that had existed since the ancient times, bringing great shock to everyone. This aura was faintly emitted, shocking everyone on the auspicious cloud. Among them, the one who was affected the most was Yuan Liangzi. Yuan Liangzi could no longer suppress the hostility between his brows and suddenly burst out. He roared, Why? Why are you telling us all this? Why are you toying with us like this? As he yelled, a huge ball of light appeared on his body. It was a ball of light that emitted endless light and heat, even causing the surrounding space-time to distort and collapse. This was obviously a level 8 false saint treasure. Although a magical treasure that looked like a ball of light looked a little strange, the aura and appearance on it were obviously a level 8 false saint treasure. Luo Fan and the rest knew something was wrong when they saw this. They quickly retreated, and in the blink of an eye, they were hundreds of miles away. Although they could not escape from Hao Zun's aura, they tried their best to get as far away from Yuan Liangzi as possible. Just as they regained their footing, Yuan Liangzi had already charged towards Hao Zun with the ball of light. The power of this collision was earth-shattering. Even Luo Fan could vaguely feel the demon world shake a little. The great Tao that had merged with the nomological law layer seemed to have been separated from this area due to this terrifying collision. One could imagine how terrifying this collision was. Hao Zun merely raised his hand and clenched it expressionlessly in the face of this collision that could even shake the demon world. The ball of light on Yuan Liangzi's body had already landed in his hand, turning into a ball the size of a fist and spinning within it. Meanwhile, Yuan Liangzi's body was directly fixed in the void by an invisible force. He maintained his fierce and violent expression as energy surged from his body and continuously spread out, distorting the surrounding space-time. Hao Zun caressed the spinning level, 8 false saint treasure and said calmly, Why? It seems like you're dissatisfied with the cultivation prospects that I've revealed to you. As Hao Zun spoke, a baby-like smile appeared on his face. It was a smile that had never appeared on his face ever since he had appeared. He continued, however, I just wanted to see your expression. I wanted to see how your seemingly firm Taoist heart would crumble and crumble. Chapter 1375. After Yuan Liangzi disappeared, Hao Zun turned around and asked the remaining Luo Fan and the others, What about you guys? Has your Tao heart collapsed? He had a faint smile on his face. However, the craziness in his smile couldn't be any more obvious. Everyone had seen Yuan Liangzi's fate just now. Even if their cultivation had collapsed, they would still regroup due to their desire to live. Who would dare say anything else? Hao Zun didn't mind and turned to look at the aura domain. More specifically, he was looking at the other Hao Zun that had appeared in the aura domain, which contained the holy decree. At the same time, the other Hao Zun had already stepped into the space-time channel and appeared directly in the middle of the cluster of worlds. Compared to a level 9 pseudo-saint without the holy decree, the might of a level 9 pseudo-saint that had obtained the holy decree was many times stronger. The huge black tortoise formed by countless worlds was already an incredible behemoth compared to an ordinary level 9 pseudo-saint. It was enough to render a level 9 pseudo-saint like a yuan venerate powerless and have no choice but to be confined to a certain realm. However, compared to Hao Zun, who had already condensed the holy decree, this array formation was like a gentle breeze. No matter how the worlds revolved around it, producing all sorts of incredible might and condensing power beyond imagination, it couldn't affect Hao Zun in the slightest. He floated there as though he was the master of these countless worlds. Even the way these worlds operated changed, allowing the originally extremely complete and detailed black tortoise to gradually lose its form. They gradually lost their forms and turned into a whirlpool with Hao Zun as the center. After Hao Zun changed the array formation, he raised his hand and grabbed at the small black tortoise that had originally been at the heart of the black tortoise, which was also the realm where the remnants of the demon realm had originally existed. The small black tortoise was originally stretching and shrinking like a beating heart. Suddenly, the huge black tortoise formed by many worlds was twisted and turned into a vortex. Under the pull of the vortex, the small black tortoise's way of shrinking and shrinking naturally changed. It looked as though its heart was beating erratically. When Hao Zun, who had condensed the holy decree, grabbed the black tortoise, the black tortoise was immobilized in the void, and it seemed to be suppressed by a fearsome force, unable to continue its movements. Zun Hao let out a long breath. He said, "Die," saying. Revered Hao, who had condensed the holy will, retracted his hand. That little black tortoise, which was a world that was countless times more powerful than the great 1,000 worlds, collapsed in an instant. They were instantly annihilated and disappeared. Such a change triggered a strong chain reaction. In the blink of an eye, the worlds that had formed a huge whirlpool around Hao Zun collapsed one by one. The fragments of the worlds turned into smoke and spread in all directions. It was a cruel beauty. At this moment, Hao Zun revealed a doubtful expression. "It can't be that simple," as he murmured. Hao Zun, who was in the mist formed by the fragments of the world, emitted his power and swept through the surroundings. The countless fragments of the world that had turned into mist were swept away by his power. In the blink of an eye, Hao Zun was the only one left floating in the air. Hao Zun's expression turned even uglier. "It's really over." It was like a person who was bent on revenge had prepared for decades, only to realize in the end that he didn't need to prepare much at all. All he had to do was walk over and say that he was going to kill him, and the other party would die. The disappointment of punching empty air was enough to make anyone feel extremely uncomfortable. Although Hao Zun was already a level 9 pseudo-sanctuary, one could see his mentality from how he had toyed with the Dao hearts of Yuan Liangzi and the others. It was easy to imagine how depressed he was after such an experience. Feeling depressed, Hao Zun suddenly raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. The level 7 and level 8 pseudo-sanctuaries beside Luo Fan instantly fell into his hands. Then, Hao Zun gently squeezed, and the cultivators collapsed one by one. They didn't even have the chance to scream before they all died, as if they had never appeared. Such a cruel thing happened to Luo Fan just like that, which was a huge blow to him. His heart raced as an indescribable sense of impending death made his expression change. Just as he thought that Hao Zun was going to crush him to death, Hao Zun stopped. He turned his gaze to another location, to the aura of the heaven and earth. At that moment 2 figures appeared. One was a Yuan Venerate. The other was a familiar figure with the upper body of a human and the lower body of a tortoise. It was the level 9 pseudo-sanctuary that had been left behind in the mysterious Yang heaven and earth. The two of them didn't seem hostile at all. Instead, they seemed very harmonious and friendly. Even their powers seemed to have a mysterious connection. After they appeared, the terrain of the heaven and earth changed with a loud bang. The ground seemed to be kneaded and moved by an invisible hand as it started to change its shape rapidly. At the same time, the 666 pseudo-sanctuary cultivators, who were already skinny, suddenly emitted a strange aura. This aura didn't belong to these pseudo-sanctuaries. Instead, it belonged to someone else. It belonged to a Yuan Venerate. Under the influence of the 666 Yuan Venerate's aura, Hao Zun, who had just condensed a holy decree that had destroyed many realms, suddenly collapsed. The invisible holy decree split into two and entered the body of the Yuan Venerate and the other person in the heaven and earth aura. Instantly, the auras of the two of them started to skyrocket, causing the time and space around them to distort even more intensely. Although all this took a long time to describe, it actually happened at an unimaginable speed. It even seemed to have transcended time. By the time Luo Fan saw it clearly, everything had already been settled. Luo Fan suddenly felt that he wasn't surprised at all when he saw everything that was supposed to happen. Indeed, a level 9 pseudo-sanctuary, Luo Fan wasn't surprised, as this wasn't surprising at all. However, Hao Zun's reaction was a little strange. He wasn't angry that he had been schemed against. Instead, he was a little excited. Indeed, I knew that you wouldn't die so easily. Taoist Hao Zun, you have failed again this time, the Yuan Venerate said. Hao Zun laughed excitedly. I have failed? No. I have not failed. The deity had achieved unprecedented success, because I have forced you to cooperate with the remnants of the demon realm. You have truly betrayed the main world and our realm. From today onwards, you will never be recognized by a sage again. Your path to becoming a sage has finally been completely severed. Ha ha ha. Hao Zun's laughter didn't hold back at all. The rumbling laughter spread in all directions, shaking the space-time. It shook the nomological laws. It shook the great path. In an instant, Luo Fan, who was wrapped up in this laughter, couldn't help but feel an inexplicable sense of amusement welling up in his heart. He almost couldn't help but laugh out loud. Startled, he hurriedly used the power of the divine court sky cauldron to suppress his spirit. He finally managed to extricate himself from that strange laughter. When his spirit returned to normal, he suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of helplessness. Although he already knew that a level 9 false sage was unparalleled, just this laughter, which wasn't directed at him, was already somewhat unbearable. What a huge blow to him! The Yuan Venerate said nonchalantly, "The path to becoming a sage? Don't you know very well? We have no hope of becoming a sage in the first place. There are 54 sages in this world, and each sage has at least 10 disciples under them. Even if a sage allows someone to become a sage, that person will definitely appear among them. Although people like us are known as venerable ones, compared to them we are nothing. No matter how much we try to please the sages, becoming a sage is just an extravagant hope for us, isn't it?" The Yuan Venerate paused and suddenly smiled. "Furthermore, how do you know that I am not doing this under the orders of a sage?" Hao Zun's expression didn't change at all when he heard the first part, as if these words couldn't reach his heart. However, his expression changed slightly when he heard the last part. Although what he said before was correct, it was not enough. However, it couldn't be denied that before today, the Yuan Venerate had an insignificant hope of becoming a sage. Although this hope was so small that it was almost non-existent, it was still different from nothing. Now, after today's incident, the Yuan Venerate didn't even have this tiny hope anymore. No matter how nice and open-minded the Yuan Venerate sounded, this was already a victory for him. It meant that his plan today had worked. However, the last part of the sentence completely overturned his plan. If this incident was the result of an order from a sage, If this demon realm remnant before him was someone the sage wanted to rope in and their cooperation was arranged by a sage, then all his previous deductions would be meaningless. On the contrary, his plan today might actually help the Yuan Venerate gain a higher status in the eyes of a certain sage. At this thought, Hao Zun shouted, "Impossible! These remnants of the demon realm invaded this world, and almost caused the destruction of the world. They have committed heinous sins. How could the sage rope them in?" The Yuan Venerate chuckled and said, "You can guess. Did I lie to deliberately attack you, or was it really the saint who asked me to do this?" The level 9 pseudosage beside the Yuan Venerate also smiled and said, "Is there a need to guess? If it wasn't for the sage's orders, how would I have dared to step foot into this world? How would I have dared to bring my people into your world?" These words were like a final veil being lifted, completely dispelling any wishful thinking that Hao Zun still had. Regardless of his standpoint, what the level 9 pseudosage said was right. For such a long time, he didn't even dare to step into this world. He only dared to open up a world outside of this world for the remnants of the devil realm to live and reproduce. But now, he actually dared to step into this world and even took his people with him, abandoning the world that they had lived in for countless years to step into this world. Could it be that he couldn't see the changes in the situation? Hao Zun's expression fluctuated for a while before he suddenly took a deep breath. "So that's how it is. I didn't want to offend them at first. However, it seems like some things have to be done now." Everyone present instantly had an inexplicable doubt. They didn't know what Hao Zun was talking about or who he was referring to. At that moment, an indescribable feeling suddenly enveloped Luo Fan, making him feel like an ordinary person being stared at by a 5-clawed divine dragon. Then, he realized that the Yuan Venerate's palm had unknowingly penetrated deep into his body through his heart. A strange feeling was born. In a trance, he felt the palm penetrate deep into the internal space-time layers of his body. Layer by layer, it finally broke through the limits and reached a depth that Luo Fan couldn't detect. He didn't know what it was. The arm penetrated deep into Luo Fan's body. Hao Zun's face naturally appeared in front of Luo Fan. The distance between him and Luo Fan. It wasn't even a foot. This was the closest this had ever happened to Luo Fan when he was facing a level 9 pseudo-sage. At that moment, countless thoughts flashed through his mind. In a trance, Luo Fan understood why Hao Zun had treated him differently back then, why Hao Zun hadn't been surprised by his calm performance, why Hao Zun had crushed a level 7 pseudo-sage and a level 8 pseudo-sage when he had vented his anger, and why Hao Zun had said that he didn't want to offend them, but now he had to. All of this was because of the two holy wills that the Divine Venerate and his disciple had injected into the space-time deep within his body. At that moment, Hao Zun was grabbing at these two holy wills. The moment Hao Zun moved, the expressions of the Yuan Venerate and the level 9 pseudo-sage of Mysterious Sun Sky changed slightly. At this time, they cast their probing eyes on Luo Fan for the first time. The Yuan Venerate was the first to see the flaw and couldn't help but curse. "Damn it! There are actually two hidden holy wills besides a level 9 pseudo-sage treasure." Very soon, the level 9 pseudo-sage of Mysterious Sun Sky also saw this and his expression changed drastically. "You didn't say that there would be two more level 9 Venerates participating. If I had known, I wouldn't have cooperated with you no matter what." The Yuan Venerate quickly calmed down and said, "Don't worry, I have already hidden many trump cards on these cultivators. What I am using now is just one of them." As she said that, she raised her hand and the aura collapsed with a loud bang. Along with the aura, the 666 pseudo-sage cultivators and the 666 level 8 pseudo-sage treasures that had completely fused with these cultivators also collapsed. After they collapsed, specks of light emerged from where they had collapsed and began to condense rapidly. However, this time, they didn't converge into the bodies of the two of them. Instead, They converged directly into the body of the Yuan Venerate. As the specks of light converged, the holy will aura emitted from the Yuan Venerate's body, which was only half the size of Hao Zun's body, began to strengthen rapidly and finally became complete. They were all level 9 pseudo-sages. Although they had spoken and acted, it had all happened in a very short time. The entire process had been completed almost without any need for time. At that moment, Hao Zun's arm was pulled away from Luo Fan's body. In his hands were two formless holy wills that exuded an aura of indestructibility, and indestructibility. At that moment, Luo Fan felt an unimaginable pain surging from the depths of his body. He even felt the layers of time and space in the depths of his body collapsing layer by layer. He could feel the countless spaces and worlds in between the layers of time and space rapidly shattering. Following this process, his body began to gradually collapse. A strong feeling that he was walking towards death, that his life essence was gradually withering away enveloped him. An inexplicable fear naturally arose. However, even this fear and all sorts of feelings seemed to gradually drift away from him. The darkness that was getting stronger and more obvious gradually drowned him. He seemed to be falling into the abyss of eternal stillness, falling into a place where he would never be able to reincarnate. So this is how it feels to have one's holy will extracted. Is this a normal reaction, or is this what the Divine Venerate and his disciple did to me back then? A thought suddenly emerged in his mind amidst the stillness of his thoughts. He knew very well that he was heading towards death and destruction. His body, his soul, his will, his consciousness, his senses, everything about him was heading towards extinction. Time seemed to slow down as he gradually walked towards the abyss and towards death. In the end, at some point in time, everything seemed to have come to a standstill, as if time had stopped. Countless memories and thoughts suddenly appeared out of nowhere in this state of stillness. They occupied this originally boundless, pitch-black space and began to evolve in the order they had been in before. Again and again, it made him feel as though he was reliving his entire life, and his entire life. At a certain moment, he suddenly had a strange realization. Hao Zun's words, which he initially couldn't understand, suddenly became extremely clear and understandable. Chapter 1376. As he came to this realization, his body began to emit an extremely wondrous charm. This kind of charm was almost indestructible and almost indestructible. This was shockingly a kind of holy will, but it was different from holy will. This kind of charm was not as eternal as the holy decree. It was indestructible, but it had a potential that the holy decree did not have. It had the potential to continuously improve, strengthen, and grow. If one had to make a comparison, this kind of charm was still quite different from the holy decree. It was like a small spring, small but able to continuously gush out spring water. Although the holy decree obtained by a level 9 pseudo-saint was as vast as the ocean, it would only decrease and not increase. When this charm appeared, Luo Fan felt that the boundless darkness around him had completely disappeared. What replaced it was an indescribable clarity. In his body, the infinite spacetime in the layers of spacetime was instantly reconstructed in a very strange and mysterious way. Layers of spacetime were reconstructed, causing the scene inside Luo Fan's body to not only return to its peak, but also improve by one level. Compared to the past, it had become more stable and more mysterious. I'm on the road to the Sage Realm, and so are the level 9 fake saint. Although they've gone further than me, they're on the same path. In this way, although I can't really do what a level 9 fake saint can do, it's absolutely possible to do something a little bit inferior. This was the enlightenment that Luo Fan had just now. And this point was clear to him. It instantly stimulated the essence of cultivation that Luo Fan had ever since he became a sage to be, causing his entire person to change dramatically. This change did not allow his cultivation to advance to an unimaginable level. Instead, it allowed him to unleash the various powers that he had obtained by imitating the powers of a saint that he should have originally possessed and had already obtained. Among them, this included the holy decree that was not as mysterious as the holy decree, but its essence was exactly the same. It was this holy decree that caused the collapse of the holy decree caused by the loss of the Divine Lord and his disciple to instantly gain new support. The true support that belonged to him was formed once again. This allowed Luo Fan, who was on the verge of death, to recover. When Luo Fan recovered, he realized that less than a moment had passed since Zun Hao extracted the two Saint Wills from his body. At this moment, the two invisible Saint Wills in Hao Zun's hands left his body. As for the Yuan Venerate, only then did he manage to turn the 666 pseudo-sage cultivators and 666 pseudo-sage level 8 treasures into nourishment for his holy decree. This allowed the holy decree he possessed to become truly complete. At this moment, the profound Yang Heaven's rank 9 false divine sage's face changed. His body swayed and a black tortoise appeared behind him. This was a huge battle array. It contained the essence of billions of worlds that had been destroyed by Hao Zun and possessed incredible defensive strength. Although it did not have much resistance against a profound Yang Heaven's rank 9 false divine sage, it was almost an impenetrable iron wall for ordinary profound Yang Heaven's rank 9 false divine sages. Although such an array formation, in addition to the half of the holy decree that Hao Zun had obtained, might not be able to completely block a Yuan Venerate or Hao Zun, it would definitely not be a problem for him to hold them off for some time while waiting for reinforcements from the other party. The Yuan Venerate did not care that the profound Yang Heaven's rank 9 false divine sage beside him was obviously wary of him. He had a look of pity on his face. However, he did not know if he was feeling pity for the 666 pseudo-sage level 8 treasures, the 666 pseudo-sage cultivators, or the trump cards he had placed in the bodies of the pseudo-sage cultivators. She raised her hand and grabbed at the void where Hao Zun was. In an instant, a strange space-time appeared around Hao Zun's body. After this space-time appeared, it seemed to trigger a chain reaction as countless space-times were born one after another. These countless space-times had an unimaginably powerful splitting ability. They wrapped around Hao Zun and targeted him, trying to separate his entire body into countless tiny parts. At this moment, Hao Zun laughed out loud. As he laughed, the two holy wills in his hands suddenly swelled and formed an invisible area around his body that was enveloped by the holy decree, completely blocking the boundless space-time. At the same time, it also enveloped Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's aura, which was similar to the holy will, was released, and Zun Hao sensed it. In an instant, Hao Zun had a look of disbelief on his face. At the same time, the Yuan Venerate and the profound Yang Heaven's rank 9 false divine sage also had a look of disbelief on their faces. Everyone's eyes were on Luo Fan. Even at this moment, the two Saint Wills in Hao Zun's hands had completely blocked off the countless spacetime and even destroyed the spacetime to restore the surroundings to normal. However, it did not attract the attention of the two parties. Hao Zun murmured as his eyes turned bloodshot. How is this possible? How can this holy decree exist? Luo Fan was secretly shocked by their strange gazes. He didn't care about anything else and immediately took out the divine sky cauldron. It hung high above his head. He discovered the changes in himself the moment he took out the divine sky cauldron. In the past, he had taken out the divine sky cauldron like an ordinary person taking out a mountain. Even though he knew that this mountain possessed incredible power and extraordinary destructive power, he had always felt powerless. However, he felt powerless. He was always worried that he would collapse and be destroyed at any moment because he could not bear the weight of this huge mountain. However, at this moment, all he felt was an indescribable sense of ease and unimaginable freedom. It was as if the divine sky cauldron had become one of his arms and a part of his body. The power of the divine sky cauldron itself no longer pressured him. It was no longer pressuring him. Instead, it had become his own strength. Thanks to this powerful support, he suddenly felt that the rank 9 false divine sages in front of him weren't as high and mighty as before. In his days, he could even faintly sense that it had become an extremely difficult task for them to kill him. In fact, he even had a strange feeling that the level 9 pseudo-divine sage in profound yang heaven and earth had suddenly become much weaker. He felt as if he only needed to grab it with one hand. He would be able to break through the barrier of the array formation on the surface of his body and hurt his body directly. Luo Fan muttered, "This is the effect of will." An inexplicable smile gradually appeared on his face. As Luo Fan mumbled, the expressions on Hao Zun and the others' faces changed. In their eyes, this person in front of them, it had completely fused with the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure above its head. The intent that was similar to holy will was directly added to the magic treasure. It caused the magic treasure's power to increase greatly. If they wanted to hurt this person like before, it would be as difficult as hurting a rank 9 false divine sage. It was as difficult as hurting a rank 9 false divine sage with holy will. This kind of change was completely beyond their imagination. In a trance, they suddenly had a feeling that they didn't think they would ever have. They suspected that they were dreaming. As their emotions surged, they suddenly felt that the fight between them was meaningless. The space-time gradually returned to its normal state. The boundless sea reappeared below, and even the space-time passageway gradually disappeared. It seemed as if nothing had happened. The rank 9 false divine sage of profound yang heaven spoke at this moment. "You're Luo Fan, right?" Luo Fan raised his eyebrows. The fact that this rank 9 false divine sage was saying this meant that he was starting to take him seriously. Luo Fan couldn't help but smile faintly and nod. "That's right." The rank 9 false divine sage said, "My name is Gomard. According to the customs of the demon realm, you can call me Mo Zun." Yuan venerates and the others called profound yang heaven the demon realm because it was a completely different world compared to the demon realm. It was a world that had invaded this world. Obviously, the demon realm was also a different world compared to profound yang heaven. It was also the target of their invasion, so it was naturally the true demon realm. No one present was surprised by this form of address. They weren't in the mood to refute it. On the contrary, Yuan Venerate smiled faintly and said to Luo Fan, "You are now qualified to be called a Venerate. Perhaps I can teach you Luo Zun?" Luo Fan was taken aback when he heard this. He repeated, "Luo Zun?" Hao Zun took a deep breath and said, "That's right. Even though your cultivation isn't at the 9th level of the false divine realm, you're still a saint. Although your cultivation isn't at the level of a rank 9 false divine sage, your current performance isn't something an ordinary rank 9 false divine sage can achieve. There's nothing wrong with calling yourself a Venerate." Luo Fan knew that the three of them definitely had something to say when they persuaded him to call himself a Venerate. He didn't beat around the bush and said, "Let's not talk about calling myself a Venerate first. What exactly do you want to say? Please speak your mind." The three Yuan Venerates exchanged a glance and saw a smile in each other's eyes. Even Hao Zun, who had seemed a little crazy before, seemed normal now. His hatred for Yuan Venerates had completely disappeared, and he seemed like two good friends with Yuan Venerate. In the end, it was Hao Zun who spoke. "We would like to discuss the Tao with you." "That's right." The two Yuan Venerates smiled. Luo Fan was taken aback. "Discuss the Tao? You must be joking. I've only set foot on the 4th platform. Compared to all of you, I'm still miles away. Even if I have the ability to escape from all of you, I'm only relying on the power of my treasures. How can my experience compare to all of you? How am I qualified to discuss the Tao with all of you?" Hao Zun laughed. "Normally, a cultivator on the 4th platform wouldn't be able to escape from the few of us even if he had 100 level 9 false divine treasures. It's already extraordinary for you to be able to do this with a level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. Even if you're a little weak, you're definitely not weak. Mo Zun chuckled. Forget it. Do we still care about face in front of the Tao? I want to find the path to the Tao from you. I hope you can give me some pointers. Yuan venerate how both sighed and nodded their heads in acknowledgement. Luo Fan was taken aback when he heard this. The doubts in his heart were finally resolved when he saw the expressions of the three of them. So that's why. The three of them saw the hope of becoming sages from him. They saw the possibility of their improvement. There were all sorts of disputes between the three of them. There were all sorts of grudges. It seemed like they couldn't live under the same sky and wouldn't stop until one of them was dead. However, this was all. It was only because of their despair. Because they couldn't see the direction to advance. Because they couldn't see the possibility of advancing further. In other words, the fundamental reason why they were fighting each other. It was because they couldn't see the hope of becoming sages. For a Class 9 pseudo-saint who had cultivated for trillions of years and regarded cultivation as their everything, and regarded becoming a saint as their ultimate goal, not being able to see the hope of becoming a saint was equivalent to cutting off all their hope. It was equivalent to eliminating everything that supported them in their lives. Such an outcome was obviously an indescribable blow to their Tao hearts. It was precisely because of this that they cared about the enmity between them and schemed against each other. Otherwise, why would a level 9 false divine who was only one step away from becoming a sage not work hard to cultivate and become a sage? Why would they risk their lives to fight each other? Even if they had any grudges, wouldn't they be able to do whatever they wanted after becoming a sage? They wanted the other party to die in any way they wanted. But now, they saw an unprecedented possibility in Luo Fan. Their hopes of becoming a sage that had been shattered suddenly reignited. Their Tao hearts that had many cracks were naturally formed again. In this way, the enmity that they held in such high regard before was naturally no longer important. Even the so-called battle between the orthodox and devil paths and the so-called fading out of the demon realm to invade the main world were no longer important. In front of the path of becoming a sage, everything else was insignificant. After understanding the thoughts of the three of them, Luo Fan was relieved. He was able to make such great progress and use his level 4 false divine court heavenly cauldron to perfectly control the level 9 false divine court heavenly cauldron and obtain a will that was similar to a sage's will. On the surface, it seemed like he had understood what Hao Zun had said and stimulated his cultivation essence, allowing him to obtain many sage-like powers. However, the real reason was that his cultivation essence was close enough to the path of becoming a sage and could simulate the power of a sage. His comprehension of what Hao Zun had said had merely stimulated his cultivation essence. What had really allowed him to achieve what he had now, and what had shocked Venerate Hao and Yuan Venerate Hao and made them feel like they saw hope of becoming a saint again, was his cultivation essence. And obviously, for Luo Fan, the essence of his cultivation was that he had his own unique worldview that was completely compatible with him. It was completely different from anyone else, any world, any heaven and earth, and any universe. Apart from this, everything else, including his flawless state, didn't affect his foundation, of course. His comprehension of Hao Zun's words wasn't considered a big deal. However, his flawless state was even more profound. Unless he had no other choice, he was absolutely unwilling to reveal it. This wasn't because he was being selfish, but because the three people in front of him had schemed against him before. Hao Zun had even almost played him to death. Faced with these three people, he couldn't have any good feelings towards them, no matter how well they spoke. Therefore Luo Fan said, "Seniors, you're too polite. How can I guide you on the path of becoming a sage?" Senior Hao Zun was the main reason why I was able to achieve such a huge breakthrough all of a sudden. Hao Zun said thoughtfully, As for me, I don't think I gave you any pointers just now. Luo Fan smiled bitterly and said, "The two holy intents in your hands were placed into the spacetime within my body by the two seniors because they thought highly of me. After the two holy intents entered my body, they fused with the deep layers of spacetime within my body. They were almost inseparable and undetectable. When Senior Hao Zun extracted the two holy intents, the space-time within my body was completely chaotic and collapsed, causing me to be on the brink of death." Hao Zun looked a little embarrassed when he heard this. Regardless of whether he was embarrassed or ashamed of his previous behavior, he had to show such an expression when he wanted to ask Luo Fan and ask for advice from Luo Fan. Otherwise, it would be considered a provocation and an attempt to provoke Luo Fan. How could he, who had found hope of becoming a sage, do such a thing? Yuan Zun and Mo Zun looked at Hao Zun with dissatisfaction, as if they were condemning Hao Zun on behalf of Luo Fan. This was a necessary gesture. How could Luo Fan not know what they were trying to say? He sneered inwardly but said with a smile, "I'm not blaming Senior Hao Zun. On the contrary, I have to thank you for your help. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have been able to comprehend the true meaning of your words and achieve what I have today." His words surprised Hao Zun and the others. Chapter 1377. Next, Luo Fan used the most accurate words he could to describe what he had comprehended at the last moment. As a fourth-level pseudo-saint level being, his ability to use words to describe the mysteries of the Great Path was naturally unimaginable. His narration struck Hao Zun and the others like they were struck by lightning. In an instant, everyone's eyes became a little dazed. In his eyes, there seemed to be an endless stream of runes and diagrams pouring out in torrents and flowing. When Luo Fan saw their expressions, he instantly knew that they had comprehended a lot of things from his words. He could not help but show a faint smile on his face. Of course, he was not pleased that they had comprehended something. Instead, he knew that since they had comprehended something, it meant that they believed in him. This also meant that they wouldn't take him seriously anymore. It was no longer a problem for him to leave now. In other words, when they comprehended the mysteries contained in his words, it meant that Luo Fan had already escaped. How could he not feel happy about this? The three of them stood in the void for a few days. In the end, the first to change was Hao Zun. In the blink of an eye, a strange aura suddenly surged out from his body. This intent was different from the holy decree. Although it had a hint of eternal and indestructible charm, it was still far from the holy decree. It was so much so that it was at least 10 times worse than Luo Fan's divine will, which seemed like a divine will, yet wasn't. But even so, this was a power that had completely fused with him and was completely under his control. It was an intent that could never be taken away. With this intent, the strength that he could display was not any weaker than when he had grasped the Saint Will. Such a huge improvement was enough to make any level 9 pseudo-saint level be delighted or even shocked. Hao Zun also came back to his senses at this moment. An indescribable sense of satisfaction and carefreeness appeared on his face. The radiance emitted from his face. It was as if a person who had been walking in the darkness suddenly had a bright light in front of him, and he could see the endless road in front of him. As Venerate Hao's body changed, similar changes also happened to Yuan Venerate Mo and Venerate Hao. Their bodies also emitted a will that seemed like a saint's will, but was not. As for the will on their bodies, it was similar to the true holy will. In fact, it was much weaker than the will on Luo Fan's body. It was a kind of eternal and indestructible charm. They were far from it. However, just like Hao Zun, although their intents weren't as good as Hao Zun's, the increase in their abilities was extremely powerful, almost reaching a whole new level. It had reached a level similar to when he had obtained the holy decree. Yuan Venerate and Venerate Mo even expelled the holy intent that they had painstakingly searched for in order to better integrate this intent that belonged to them. Their bodies were only left with the will that belonged to them. by the time the three of them came back to their senses, there were 4 holy intents floating in the void in front of everyone. They were like 4 invisible air currents that no one was willing to collect. Hao Zun and the other 2 looked at each other and smiled. They bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Thank you, Taoist Luo Fan." After saying that, they turned around and took a step forward. They went in 2 different directions and disappeared in front of Luo Fan, leaving the 4 holy intents behind. It was as if they had really treated them like ordinary air. Luo Fan couldn't help but feel a little helpless as he watched them leave so decisively. Previously, for the sake of the holy wills, they even schemed against each other, turning the hundreds of pseudo-sage cultivators into pawns and food, completely destroying them. Now that the holy wills had been condensed, they had abandoned the holy wills as if they were worn-out shoes, as if they did not care at all. Although their departure was a little out of Luo Fan's expectations, it wasn't something he couldn't understand. To Hao Zun and the others, no matter how nice their words were and how they addressed Luo Fan as Luo Zun. However, it didn't change the fact that Luo Fan was a 4th-level pseudo-saint level cultivator and they were 9th-level pseudo-saint level. In other words, they couldn't change the fact that Luo Fan had a relatively low status in their hearts. Therefore, no matter what, they still looked down on Luo Fan in their hearts. Under the circumstances, they thought that they had already obtained the truth about how powerful Luo Fan was and that they already knew the best cultivation experience that Luo Fan could give them. How could they still think highly of Luo Fan? How could they possibly stay and waste their breath on Luo Fan? To them, leaving was a matter of course. As for why the eternal and indestructible intent in Luo Fan's intent was more powerful than theirs, they only thought that Luo Fan was the first to comprehend it, so he was given preferential treatment. They didn't think that Luo Fan had anything that could inspire them. Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh as he watched them leave. He looked at the 4 holy intents in front of him with a headache and hesitated. He had already comprehended his own intent, so these holy intents were completely meaningless to him. However, it was obvious that these holy intents were good stuff even though they didn't mean much to him. It would indeed be a pity to waste it here. After thinking about it, Luo Fan controlled the divine quartz heavenly cauldron and wrapped it around the holy intents. He then turned around and took a light step forward, teleporting away from this troublesome place. This time, Luo Fan didn't go to a mortal town to live. Instead, he opened up a cave residence on an uninhabited island and entered it to deal with the 4 holy intents. Among the 4 holy intents, 2 of them were from the Divine Lord and his disciple. He didn't know if there were any hidden schemes. Before he figured it out, he didn't dare to use these 2 holy intents. Fortunately, he now had his own intent. He was no longer at a complete loss when it came to dealing with these 2 holy intents. Instead, he had all kinds of necessary means to figure out the authenticity of these 2 holy intents. His intent. Although its level was far inferior to the holy intents, the 2 were essentially the same existence. It was like using a lathe with lower precision to create a lathe with higher precision through various means. Using his intent, there was hope that he could study the mystery of the holy intents. The divine quartz heavenly cauldron had now become a part of his body. He used the power of the divine quartz heavenly cauldron as if he was using his own strength. Moreover, in the process of using this power, he could instinctively obtain the abilities that a level 9 pseudo-saint should have. As a result, the cave residence he opened up was many times more powerful than the cave residence he opened up in the past. It was countless times more powerful than the cave abode he had opened up in the past. The stability of the space and the stability of time was even stronger than that of the demon realm and even the Earth universe. Of course, this did not mean that he could open up a world more powerful than the devil realm or the Earth's universe. There were too many things involved, and it was not something that could be fully represented by the stability of the space and time. However, to be able to open up such a powerful cave residence, This was enough to show how extraordinary his means were. Moreover, in addition to the stability of time and space, this cave residence also had some very special features. It was different from the Devil Realm and even other worlds. Every world had a completely different rule. That was, this cave residence could nourish the intent on Luo Fan's body. As long as he was in this cave residence, the intent on his body that seemed like the holy intents but was not the holy intents could continue to strengthen and transform into the real holy intents. Of course, this kind of intent was formed from the essence of his cultivation. Of course, it was impossible to raise it to a higher level by such means. The speed and extent of the increase would definitely be extremely insignificant. However, this was after all a kind of benefit. After all, it also represented the mysteries of this cave residence. But it was already an extremely incredible means. In this cave residence, Luo Fan felt inexplicably comfortable. Sitting in the void, the divine court's heavenly cauldron shook slightly and revealed the four holy intents directly in front of him. In the past, he still needed to guess and guess when he saw the holy intents, but now, he could already directly see the true body of the holy intent. The holy intents did not have a physical body, but they really did exist, an abstract and peculiar existence. In front of Luo Fan, at first glance, they looked like streams of air, but upon a closer look, one would find that it was a world. After a closer look, it looked like a great way, and in the blink of an eye, it seemed to have turned into a human figure. It was truly indescribably wondrous and unpredictable. After a little identification, Luo Fan found the owners of the four holy intent. Among the four holy intents, the one that belonged to the Divine Lord was the most powerful, had the most changes, and was the most unpredictable. Its eternal and inextinguishable charm was also the strongest holy intent. In addition, the holy intent condensed by the Divine Lord's disciple was slightly inferior, but the holy intent contained in the holy intent was still powerful and shocking. Apart from these two holy intents, the other two holy intents were also holy intents, but they were much weaker. Moreover, Luo Fan could faintly see some extremely subtle flaws in the holy intents, as well as some inexplicable heterogeneity that should not have existed, that was obviously the effect of the two holy intents coming from an improper source. Li Hao did not look at the holy intents from an improper source and directly put them aside. With a gentle wave of his hand, the holy intents condensed by the Divine Lord had already come to his side. In the past, once such a holy will approached his body, it would naturally burrow into his body. However, at this moment, even though he was caressing the holy will like this, the holy will did not react at all. In fact, it even seemed to be trying to avoid his touch. With his eyes focused, Luo Fan looked at the holy intents in his hand. He studied the holy intents that seemed to extend out of nothingness and flow into nothingness inch by inch, carefully feeling the existence that might not belong to the holy intent. The holy intents were unpredictable, producing hundreds of millions of strange changes almost at every moment. However, as a whole, these changes showed a kind of eternal and indestructible charm. That scene was so wonderful and strange that it had reached an unimaginable level. The principles revealed in it were so profound that even Luo Fan could not comprehend them. As he carefully analyzed the mystery of the holy intents, Luo Fan's face showed inexplicable enlightenment from time to time. With these kinds of enlightenment, the intents on his body seemed to become more and more solid, and more difficult to ignore. In the past, he clearly knew how powerful these holy intents were, and that they contained unbelievably profound mysteries. However, it was impossible for him to fully understand them. It was impossible for him to comprehend anything useful from them. However, at this time, after refining the essence of his cultivation, and with the help of the Divine Court's heavenly cauldron, all the obstacles that originally existed were no longer a problem for him. Perhaps it was easier to understand it with a metaphor. The mystery of the level 9 pseudosage was like a ball of thread. In the past, when Luo Fan looked at this ball of thread, he could not find the end of the thread at all. He clearly knew that this ball of thread contained diamonds, and clearly knew that the thing wrapped in it could make his family rich and never have to worry about money, but he could not take it out no matter what. Now, facing this ball of extremely tightly wrapped thread, the essence of cultivation that he had refined. The divine quartz heavenly cauldron was like a small hand, pointing to the end of the thread. This kind of pointing. Of course, it was impossible for him to completely remove this ball of thread and obtain the treasure wrapped in it, but it had already given him the possibility of removing this ball of thread. In other words, it gave him the possibility of comprehending the mysteries of Level 9 Pseudo-Sage. It could even be said that it gave him the possibility of comprehending the mysteries of any level below that of a sage. Immersed in this indescribable enlightenment, Luo Fan felt that his cultivation realm was gradually increasing. In a trance, he did not know how much time had passed. When he came back to his senses, he realized his cultivation realm had actually unknowingly increased by a level. From the original level 4 pseudo-sage, he had directly increased another level. He had become a level 5 pseudo-sage. The whole process was so easy that he could not believe it. It was as if there were no bottlenecks at all before this. After coming back to his senses, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. Yes, there are indeed no bottlenecks in the middle. This is a major realm in itself. In this major realm, even if there are occasional obstructions, they are just obstructions, and there are no bottlenecks. At this moment, he truly felt that he was already completely different from his past self. For him, there were no bottlenecks in the 9 levels of the pseudo-sage realm. As long as he accumulated enough, he would be able to climb up the levels and naturally cross through the various realms. In the end, he would finally be promoted to level 9 pseudo-sage, and even reach the level where he could completely grasp the holy decree. This was a strange intuition that could only be understood, but could not be expressed in words. Sensing this change, Luo Fan sighed. He raised his eyes and gazed into the distance. His gaze penetrated through the layers of barriers of space and time, penetrated through the gaps between the chaotic states of heaven and hell, and directly shone into the chaotic state. He saw the boundless, peerlessly chaotic, magnificent, and boundlessly profound gray haze. At this moment, the range of the chaotic state that he could feel was already so vast that it was indescribable. And the moment he looked, the endless chaotic state naturally transformed into countless combinations and changes in his mind. He had already instinctively used the world view of laws to explain this chaotic state. This could be said to be a convenience after he had refined the essence of his cultivation, and it could also be said to be a side effect. The essence of his cultivation was originally to form his own world view, and build everything according to this world view. In the end, he would be able to be independent in the boundless chaotic state, and would never be invaded by the chaotic state. Now that he had refined the essence of his cultivation, it was naturally directly connected to his world view of laws. For this incomprehensible chaotic state, it would naturally be transformed into a state that could be explained by the world view of laws. How long has it been since I've seen such a scene? Luo Fan smiled bitterly. At this time, he had already reacted. Ever since he entered the demon realm, he had gradually lost himself in it because there were so many powerful existences that were stronger than him. Gradually, he was affected by their cultivation system and lost his insistence on his true foundation. He was almost at a loss to cultivate according to the cultivation system in the demon realm. Although such a cultivation method had allowed him to make great progress from the Tao Master realm to the current level 5 pseudo-sage realm, at the same time, he was also restricted by this cultivation system. Originally, he could even calculate the state of a sage, and he could even boldly build a flawless state according to the state of existence of a sage. But recently, he couldn't even understand the power of a level 9 pseudo-sage, and he couldn't even grasp the mysteries contained in a level 9 pseudo-sage. And he himself even felt that this situation was natural, thinking that his realm was not high enough, and he shouldn't be able to understand the state of that realm. How terrifying was this, and how sorrowful was this? Thinking back to his experiences over the years, Luo Fan suddenly broke out in a cold sweat. He had almost embarked on a path of no return. Fortunately, it was not too late to turn back now, and he still had a chance to change. Luo Fan reflected for a while, and a relaxed smile gradually appeared on his face. The will emitted from his body had actually undergone a subtle adjustment. This adjustment did not seem to be much on the surface, and if an ordinary level 9 pseudo-sage studied it carefully, they might not necessarily be able to find anything. They wouldn't feel that there was anything different about it. However, only Luo Fan knew that the nature of this holy decree had completely changed. Chapter 1378. Observing the boundless chaos in front of him that contained infinite mysteries, Li Hao began to adjust his worldview slightly according to the many mysteries that were displayed within it. Although the worldview of rules seemed extremely complete and perfect to him at that time, and he even managed to explain the state of chaos and the state before the state of chaos by relying on this worldview, he still couldn't understand it. However, as a worldview that he had sorted out before he became a sage to be, it was impossible for it to be absolutely perfect. Of course, it was impossible for it to be absolutely perfect. There were bound to be countless flaws and innumerable areas that could be made up for. It could be said that no matter what level he was at or what level his cultivation had reached, it was necessary to adjust and make up for this worldview at all times. Even if he were to attain primordial chaos Tao fruit and become a supreme, eternal, and invincible saint, this process might require him to continue adjusting his worldview. He needed to continue perfecting and perfecting his worldview. Currently, Luo Fan had been shocked by the power of the demon world after entering it and lost himself in its cultivation system. It had been a long time since he had thought about his worldview. Today, in comparison, this worldview was far behind his current cultivation realm. In other words, his current worldview was only a truly perfect worldview when he was still at the quasi-student level. At this moment, in his eyes, there were still countless flaws and imperfections in it. It couldn't explain many of the mysteries he had mastered and the various principles he could understand now. This was obviously the foundation that Luo Fan was currently lacking. If Luo Fan wanted to truly move forward on the path that he had in mind and continue to approach the mixed essence Tao fruit, what he needed to do was to make up for this foundation. In comparison, the holy decree, the demon world, and everything else were secondary to him. They were even insignificant. Even the heavenly cauldron that was floating above his head. The heavenly cauldron of the divine court that he was called Luo Zun by Hao Zun and the others was no different from trash to him now. He focused all his attention on the chaotic state that he could observe. He paid no attention to the heavenly cauldron of the divine court and the 4 strands of holy wills that he cared about before. He just let them roam freely in the cave abode. As a level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, especially one that had been skimped on, the desire for the holy will was almost engraved in the depths of their existence. Therefore, when Luo Fan relinquished his control over the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, the divine court heavenly cauldron vibrated instinctively and started to produce an indescribable attractive force that directly acted on the 4 holy wills, drawing them into the divine court heavenly cauldron and gradually fusing with it. As the holy will fused with the divine hall heavenly cauldron, the surroundings of the divine hall heavenly cauldron began to produce countless strange materials. All kinds of things were thrown into it. Be it the quantity or the rarity of those materials, they had reached an unimaginable height. If he took out the materials that were born at every instant, he might be able to refine a pseudo-saint level magic treasure. The process of the birth of such materials continued. The aura of the divine court heavenly cauldron began to gradually change. Although it was originally a level 9 pseudo-sage magic treasure, it felt a little illusory, as if its foundation was a little fake. Gradually, it became more and more real and substantial. It was as if the root cause that caused the divine court heavenly cauldron to be inferior to a real level 9 pseudo-sage treasure was gradually being eliminated. This divine court heavenly cauldron began to transform into a real level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. This process continued for more than 3,000 years before it stopped. At this time, just looking at the materials that were thrown into the divine court heavenly cauldron's foundation, let alone a level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, it would take 10 or even 100 of them. There would definitely be no problem. At this time, after more than 3,000 years, the divine court heavenly cauldron had become extremely real, and it even emitted an eternal aura. An aura that could not be worn down by 10,000 tribulations. An aura that belonged to the holy will. The existence of this aura caused the power of the divine court heavenly cauldron to increase by many times compared to before. In fact, it was thousands of times more powerful than the broken heavenly cauldron of the divine court that the main lord had refined himself. 4 level 9 pseudo-sage treasures, this holy will could help them break through. 4 level 9 pseudo-sage treasures, the holy will had the same effect. After all, from a certain macro point of view, level 9 pseudo-sage treasures and level 9 pseudo-sage treasures could be equivalent. At this point, the divine court's heavenly cauldron gradually gave birth to a consciousness as pure as a piece of white paper. In fact, a real level 9 pseudo-sage treasure should have a treasure spirit and spiritual consciousness. Even in a perfect world like Earth, which was not very beneficial for treasure spirits, a magic treasure would still give birth to some spiritual consciousness after it became a magic treasure. When it was promoted to the Tai Pure Yang level, it was very likely that it would give birth to a real treasure spirit, let alone a level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, which was almost the highest level below chaotic spiritual treasures. It was simply inevitable for a treasure spirit to be born with wisdom and spiritual consciousness. The reason why the divine court heavenly cauldron did not give birth to a treasure spirit before was very simple. It was because this magic treasure was not refined bit by Luo Fan, but was forcibly built by him by accelerating time. There were not even any materials used to refine level 9 pseudo-sage treasures. This was an obvious congenital deficiency, but this magic treasure was born with a huge flaw, which was why it could not give birth to a treasure spirit. Now that the divine court heavenly cauldron's flaw had been made up for by the holy will, and even its essence had been strengthened to an unbelievable level, the treasure spirit that should have been born a long time ago was naturally born. After this treasure spirit was born, it was extremely curious about everything around it. However, because it was Luo Fan's magic treasure, it was born with an indescribable closeness to Luo Fan. Without Luo Fan's order, it did not dare to extend its perception out of the cave abode. It only paid attention to everything in the cave abode. Of course, he was also paying more attention to the only living being in this cave, Luo Fan. At this time, Luo Fan was observing the state of chaos, comprehending various truths from it to make up for his worldview. His body naturally exuded a charm that transcended everything in the world, independent of all heaven and earth, and all the universe. Even though he was hovering in the air without making any movements, he naturally possessed an indescribable profundity. He naturally attracted the attention of all living beings, allowing everyone to comprehend some kind of extremely profound mystery from him. It was the same for the treasure spirit of the heavenly cauldron. In the process of watching Luo Fan, the treasure spirit gradually grew. His intelligence began to increase at an unimaginable speed. Thousands of years later, when it finally returned to its divine form, it was like a god. However, he discovered that he had already become a child who looked exactly the same as Luo Fan when he was young. He wasn't very cute, but he naturally revealed an eternal and indestructible charm. The boy touched his own body, and an incomparably pure and joyful smile appeared on his face. "This is how my body feels. It's so comfortable." He played excitedly for several days. Finally, he was no longer satisfied with this cave abode with extremely stable space and extremely stable time. With a thought, he raised his hand and waved. A majestic power radiated out, opening up a world in this region of the cave. There were all sorts of strange worlds, but every single one of them had something in common. First of all, these worlds were misty at the beginning. Gradually, some living beings were born, and then these living beings naturally evolved, grew naturally, and finally gained wisdom, forming a civilization. Only then did they begin to show the various forms of the world and the myriad phenomena of the mortal world. Secondly, and perhaps the most important commonality, was that each of these worlds was incomparably in line with Luo Fan's worldview. In other words, it was incomparably in line with the worldview that Luo Fan had sorted out at this time. The operation of all the laws, the circulation of all the laws, and the transformation of all things in that world were in line with the fundamental description of the worldview, in line with the logic of the worldview. There was nothing much to say about this kind of conformity. After all, the worldview itself was something that Luo Fan had sorted out to explain everything, the universe, and the state of chaos. Normally speaking, any world, any heaven and earth should be in line with the description of the worldview. However, the worlds in front of him were completely different. Other normal worlds, normal heaven and earth, even if they could be perfectly explained using the worldview of laws, and everything within them could be described using the worldview of laws, however, that was only a description. The world itself was still following another fundamental structure. When using the worldview to explain, one often had to take a detour and take many turns to be able to explain. This was like an arithmetic problem of multiplication. If one used addition to explain this problem, it could indeed be done, and it could be done extremely accurately. However, compared to directly using multiplication to explain, it was obviously a long detour for Luo Fan. Using the worldview to explain other worlds was like using addition to calculate multiplication. Although it could be explained and described accurately, there was still a layer of separation. However, the worlds in front of him did not have such a problem. For these worlds, Luo Fan's use of the worldview of laws to explain them was like using addition to explain addition arithmetic problems, or in other words, directly using multiplication to explain multiplication arithmetic problems. There was no need to take a detour at all. Not only was it accurate, but it was also direct. The reason for this? The reason was even simpler. Ever since the treasure spirit was born, it had been in the cave abode that Luo Fan had opened up. Up until now, Luo Fan was the only living being that had been seen for thousands of years. The various principles it could understand were all comprehended from Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, the treasure spirit was like a blank piece of paper, and its worldview was blank. At the critical moment, it could only see Luo Fan, so its worldview could only be Luo Fan's worldview. The worlds created by such a worldview were naturally like this. After the treasure spirit opened up many worlds, it completely cast Luo Fan aside and devoted itself to these worlds. It constantly observed these worlds and absorbed all kinds of cultivation resources from them. As a result, its intelligence began to grow rapidly. It began to become more and more intelligent, and its temperament became more and more perfect. After thousands of years, when Luo Fan finally came back to his senses, he found that the treasure spirit of the divine court heavenly cauldron had already grown to the age of 12 or 13. Moreover, there was an extremely deep wisdom in its eyes. Only when it looked at Luo Fan would there be an indescribable look of admiration and joy in its eyes. Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and he already knew that he was making up for the flaws in his worldview. Everything that had happened in the past 10,000 years, and he couldn't help but sigh, what a good opportunity. I didn't expect that these treasures that people would fight over would ultimately help you." When the treasure spirit heard Luo Fan's words, it couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. "Master, did I do something wrong?" After watching the various forms and phenomena of the mortal world that had been born in the world that it had created, it was no longer that ignorant and pure treasure spirit that was like a piece of white paper. It understood the meaning behind Luo Fan's words as soon as it heard them. It knew that the things that it had absorbed back then were probably extremely precious things. It couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. However, Luo Fan shook his head. "That's not the case. This is the best way to deal with it. Now that you've devoured and fused with it, I don't have to worry about the schemes hidden in those things." When the treasure spirit heard this, it couldn't help but feel nervous. It stammered, "This, Master, actually, I'm also afraid of scheming." When Luo Fan heard this, he couldn't help but laugh. "Ha ha ha! These schemes are only effective against me. Even if you directly use them, there won't be any bad result. Moreover, you're not using them. Instead, you directly break them up and devour them. Of course, there won't be any problems." When the treasure spirit of the heavenly cauldron heard this, it heaved a sigh of relief. "Then I can rest assured." Seeing the treasure spirit's hilarious behavior, Luo Fan smiled and shook his head. "You're already quite intelligent now. Have you given yourself a name?" When the treasure spirit heard this, its eyes widened in disbelief. "Isn't the matter of naming things Master's business? Why is Master so lazy to let me do it for him?" When Luo Fan heard this, he opened his mouth and finally said helplessly, "All right. It's my business, but don't you have any suggestions to share?" When the treasure spirit heard this, it was overjoyed. "Well, actually, I've thought of many names over the years. For example, Heavenly Court, Heavenly Cauldron, Heavenly Heaven, Heavenly Cauldron, Cauldron. These are all two-word ones. There are also three-word ones like Heavenly Court Cauldron. There are so many that I can't name them all at once." As it spoke, it actually put on an extremely distressed expression. When Luo Fan heard this name, he lost interest in listening to it. That was clearly just repeating the words Heavenly Court Cauldron over and over again. This creativity was simply terrible to the point where he couldn't stand it anymore. He sighed helplessly. Forget it. You should create your own creatures and name them." "I'll name you." This treasure spirit was clearly not satisfied. He mumbled for a while and then stopped. In the end, Luo Fan gave the Heaven Cauldron of the Divine Court a name. It was a name that made the cauldron spirit inwardly regret. It felt that it should have given itself a name more seriously. Cauldron Spirit Boy was obviously not satisfied with the name. The name was even more vulgar than the 4 words Heavenly Court Cauldron. It was the treasure spirit of the Heavenly Court Cauldron, yet it was directly called Cauldron Spirit Boy. Luo Fan was quite satisfied with the name. It was simple and straightforward, and it also made its identity clear. It was perfect for a treasure spirit. At this time, after nearly 10,000 years, Luo Fan had once again made up for his worldview, completely making up for the disconnect between his worldview and his cultivation realm. Although his cultivation realm didn't have any shocking improvement, it was still the same for Luo Fan. Although his cultivation realm did not have much improvement, his physical and mental state had undergone an earth-shattering change compared to before. The current Jian Wushuang's aura was even comparable to the holy decree condensed by an ultimate god when he broke through to the saint realm. Moreover, compared to the divine decree obtained by the ultimate god, his decree was completely from his own life source, from his own cultivation essence, and from every inch of his body and mind. Such an aura was an existence that was completely integrated with him. It was inseparable, irremovable, and inalienable. As long as his will existed, as long as his consciousness and even a little bit of his life source existed, such an aura would exist forever. With such a will, the current Luo Fan, although he still couldn't truly achieve eternal indestructibility and indestructibility. However, he had faintly possessed the means of an ultimate God. In other words, even if his soul was destroyed and his life essence was completely erased, this will would be able to condense at some point in the future and draw out his will and consciousness from nothingness. In the end, after a long period of time, he would be able to condense again and come back to life. Chapter 1379. This kind of indestructibility was definitely not a sage. Compared to a true sage who was eternal, indestructible, and indestructible no matter where they were, there was naturally no comparison at all. However, this indestructibility was enough to prove that Luo Fan was truly on the right path. This was enough to make him feel happy. When Luo Fan extracted the essence of his cultivation and turned it into a will that seemed like a holy will, but wasn't. At the same time, the aura and essence of the heavenly cauldron that he had refined naturally underwent an inexplicable change. This change caused the power of the divine court cauldron to become fundamentally different from before. This difference caused the righteous divinity, who had originally created the method to refine the divine court cauldron, to no longer be able to sense the power of this magic treasure. In other words, the situation where someone related to the righteous divinity would cross space to deal with Luo Fan as soon as he used a bit of the divine court cauldron's power would no longer occur. This was also the fundamental reason why Luo Fan was able to openly display the power of the divine court cauldron in the demon realm. But now, after thousands of years of evolution, the difference between the heavenly cauldron of the divine court and the past would only be greater, not lesser. At this point, there weren't many traces left on its body, and it was difficult to find any brand that belonged to the true Exalted One anymore. The power of Cauldron Spirit Boy had already reached the level of a level 9 pseudo-saint who had obtained sage will. It was so powerful that it allowed Luo Fan to do as he pleased in the entire demon realm. He no longer had to worry about any cultivators other than sages. With such an unexpected gain, Luo Fan was naturally quite happy. He observed the many worlds created by Cauldron Spirit Boy and instantly discovered the essence of these worlds. An indescribable complicated expression appeared on his face. Although there were others who acknowledged his worldview and treated it as their own, Luo Fan did not feel too excited or happy. This was because he knew his worldview was the most special and most suitable for him. It could even be the foundation for him to become a sage in the future. But for others, it was just a view of the world. In fact, compared to the worldview of those who had opened up a perfect world, there were still too many flaws and oversights in his worldview. It was not a truly perfect worldview. Emotionally speaking, he was naturally happy that a level 9 pseudo-sage could take his worldview as his own. However, from a rational point of view, he knew clearly. This wasn't a good thing for a 9th-grade pseudo-saint. If Luo Fan continued to cultivate according to such a worldview, unless it could actively make up for this worldview and raise Luo Fan's worldview, which had not yet reached the level of a level 9 pseudo-sage, to the level of a level 9 pseudo-sage, then it would truly have the possibility of cultivating further. However, things had already come to this. But it was already too late to change. Changing the worldview of an ordinary person was already an extremely difficult task, let alone changing the worldview of a level 9 pseudo-sage. Therefore, Luo Fan calmed himself down, smiled, praised Cauldron Spirit, and left the residence with him. As for the world within the residence and the residence itself, he couldn't be bothered to deal with them. He just left them there and left them to fend for themselves. Perhaps in the future, some living beings would discover this residence by chance and discover these worlds. From there, they would obtain great benefits and open up the path to becoming a legend. Or perhaps the living beings in those worlds would one day break through the limits of the world and rush out from those small worlds to descend into the residence. Descending into the demon realm would display a great sentiment that would be eulogized by others. However, for Luo Fan and Cauldron Spirit, there was no longer any meaning to them. There was no longer any meaning to them. The two of them were currently casually flying through the void, heading towards a place that was said to be extremely beautiful, but also extremely dangerous. It was said that it contained some profound mysteries of the demon realm. For the current Luo fan, rushing to the 4 central continents of the demon realm and witnessing the schemes and battles between sages was no longer a pressing matter for him. It could even be said that he felt that it was a very boring thing to do. After making up for the gap between his worldview and his cultivation realm, he had gained an incomparably clear understanding of his own path. All sorts of things in the demon realm had once again become the scenery on the 2 sides of his cultivation path. Perhaps he might be able to comprehend something beneficial to his own cultivation, but it could no longer shackle his mind. Even the sages of the demon realm were no longer as frightening to him as before. They were no longer the center of the world. At the very least, they were not the center of his world. After traveling for several days, Cauldron's spirit finally couldn't help but ask, "Master, where are we going?" Luo Fan didn't hide anything. He smilingly replied, "I heard that there's a heaven and earth wonder where the heavens and earth are inverted. I intend to go there and take a look." Cauldron's spirit, however, was very puzzled. He asked, "Master, why are you doing this? To us, the world is like a grain of sand. What kind of heaven and earth wonder can't we create? Why must we travel millions of miles just to see the heaven and earth wonder of this world?" Luo Fan shook his head and smiled. "Every detail of the heaven and earth wonder of my own creation is in my heart. What inspiration can I get from seeing it? How can it compare to a naturally formed heaven and earth wonder? This world might have been created by someone else. That heaven and earth wonder must have been created by someone else. There's no difference in essence from one's own creation. If Master wants to see the heaven and earth wonder created by someone else, I can create countless of them for Master." When Luo Fan heard this, he only smiled and said, "To be able to create such a great world, isn't the wonder of heaven and earth that he created worth seeing?" Cauldron Spirit's words suddenly enlightened him. He smiled embarrassedly. On this day, a bizarre distortion suddenly appeared in the void. Following that, a ray of clear light appeared in front of Luo Fan. Luo Fan creased his brows. His body went from extreme movement to extreme stillness. His body froze in front of the clear light. At this moment, the clear light dissipated slightly, revealing the object within the clear light. It was a jade slip. It was an ordinary-looking jade slip, as if it was carved out of ordinary white jade. When the jade slip appeared, it flickered. An aura that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with emanated from it. It was the aura of Venerable Hao. It was obvious that this jade slip was sent by Venerable Hao. With a gentle wave of his hand, the jade slip landed in Luo Fan's hand. In an instant, a gentle stream of information surged within the jade slip. Luo Fan raised his hand and gently swiped it. The information on the jade slip instantly appeared. After reading the information, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. Doctrine discussion? 1,000 years later? It turned out that the content of the information was an invitation. An invitation sent by Venerable Hao, inviting Luo Fan to go to this place after 1,000 years. Only level 9 pseudo-sacred level experts were allowed to participate. In other words, only level 9 venerables could participate in the doctrine discussion. This doctrine discussion was hosted by a level 9 pseudo-sacred level expert who was said to have broken through to the sage realm and obtained 9 completely different holy wills. It was held once every billion years. Until now, it had been held more than 30,000 times. In the beginning, there were only a dozen or so 9th-level pseudo-saints participating in the Tao discussion. Now, there were more than 800 people participating in the Tao discussion. This number, although it did not include all the level 9 pseudo-sacred level experts in the entire demon world, it was definitely a large portion. As a veteran level 9 pseudo-sacred level expert, Venerable Hao had participated in more than 1,000 doctrine discussion gatherings. Recommending someone to participate in this doctrine discussion gatherings was definitely a simple matter for him. The Jade slip described that he wanted to recommend Luo Fan to participate in this doctrine discussion gatherings. After a moment of surprise, Luo Fan's brows slowly furrowed, breaking through to the Sage Realm 9 times. To be able to obtain 9 holy wills. This person is truly terrifying. Just now, he was focused on the scale of the doctrine discussion gatherings, history, and Venerable Hao's position. He only took a glance at the person who held the doctrine discussion gatherings. Now that he returned to his senses, he realized that the level 9 pseudo-sacred level expert who hosted the doctrine discussion gatherings was the most terrifying person. Normally, if one walked the same path, even if one broke through to the Sage Realm countless times, one could only obtain 1 holy will at most. After all, although holy wills were called shares, they were existences that surpassed the concept of space. No matter how many there were, as long as they were of the same nature, they could be considered as one. There was only one way for a person to obtain multiple holy wills, by trying to break through to the Saint Realm. That was, every time he tried to break through to the Saint Realm, the path he took would be completely different from the path he took in the past. Only then would he be able to obtain new holy wills each time and obtain multiple holy wills in the end. In this way, the level 9 pseudo-sacred level expert actually obtained 9 holy wills when breaking through to the Sage Realm. This obviously meant that he had taken 9 different paths consecutively, and he had almost reached the end of each path, reaching the point where he could break through to the Sage Realm. Moreover, he was actually able to hold the doctrine discussion gatherings time and time again without suffering any major losses after breaking through to the Sage Realm. How powerful was he? How fearsome and terrifying was that? What kind of person is this person who continuously took 9 paths to break through to the Sage Realm? Luo Fan suddenly became quite interested in that person. In an instant, he made up his mind that he would definitely participate in this doctrine discussion gatherings, even if it was just to see the level 9 pseudo-sacred level expert who possessed 9 holy wills. At this moment, the void suddenly shook, and another 2 rays of light pierced through the air, directly turning into 2 jade slips in front of Luo Fan. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat as he vaguely guessed something when he saw it. He couldn't help but feel a little helpless after completely deciphering the information contained in the 2 jade slip. These 2 jade slips were from Yuan Venerate and Mo Zun respectively. Both of them had invited Luo Fan to participate in the doctrine discussion gatherings at the same time. However, Yuan Venerate had wanted to recommend Luo Fan to participate. On the other hand, it was Mo Zun's first time participating, so he didn't have the right to recommend others. Therefore, he had only invited Luo Fan to accompany him. After smiling bitterly, Luo Fan fell into doubt again. What do they mean by this? I have already told them what they wanted to know, and they left very decisively back then. Why did they suddenly think of me at the same time and invite me to participate in the doctrine discussion gatherings at the same time? Although he had gotten along well with Venerate Hao and Yuan Venerate in the end, it had been extremely unpleasant before. Even if they weren't enemies, they definitely weren't on very good terms. Now, if it was just Venerate Hao who had sent a jade slip to invite him to participate in the doctrine discussion gatherings, he could still treat it as a coincidence. He would think that Venerate Hao had suddenly thought of him on a whim. However, the 3 of them had thought of him at the same time and sent jade slips to invite him to participate in the doctrine discussion gatherings at the same time. This was unusual no matter how one looked at it. Could it be that they found out that I'm hiding something? Or is there something wrong with the doctrine discussion gatherings? Luo Fan frowned at the thought of this possibility, and he couldn't help raising his guard to the highest level. Venerate Hao and the rest's behavior. Before this, he had seen it clearly. The way they treated other cultivators as ordinary pawns, using and discarding them at will, the way they schemed against each other, and the way they made it hard to distinguish between friend and foe had left a deep impression on him. Now, he suddenly felt that they might have some kind of plan against him. His vigilance was unimaginable. Under this vigilance, Luo Fan instantly decided to reject the three of them. Of course, this didn't mean that he had given up on participating in the doctrine discussion gatherings. It was just that he didn't want to go with Venerate Hao and the others. He didn't plan on using Venerate Hao's recommendation to participate in the doctrine discussion gatherings. Over 800 level 9 pseudo-saints and 1,000 years, Luo Fan definitely didn't believe that he couldn't find anyone to recommend him to participate in the doctrine discussion gatherings. After making up his mind, Luo Fan didn't hesitate at all. He found a random excuse. With the help of these jade slips, Luo Fan sent his consciousness away through space and back to their owners. In just a few short breaths, Luo Fan and the others understood Luo Fan's intentions. In a strange place, Venerate Hao grabbed the jade slip that flew through space and scanned through it. The smile on his face froze. He actually rejected me? Doesn't he know how rare this opportunity is? This place was a boundless void. There was only a gigantic sun where he was. A sun that emitted boundless light and heat. He was currently sitting on a throne made of light that was completely condensed from the sun's power. There were no living beings on this sun. Only the sun below seemed extremely intelligent and emitted a faint vitality. It was like a real living being. Venerate Hao frowned for a while and finally sighed. A cultivator's mind was usually extremely resolute. It was extremely difficult to change the decision of another cultivator. In particular, Luo Fan had the strength of a level 9 supremacy at the level of a level 4 pseudo-saint. His determination was even more indescribable. Venerate Hao didn't have the confidence to use words to change Luo Fan's decision. Hence, he could only give up on his plan to recommend Luo Fan to participate in the doctrine discussion gatherings. What a pity, in a completely different world from the one Venerate Hao was in. Yuan Venerate Mo and Venerate Hao received the jade slip that Luo Fan sent through space at the same time and also received Luo Fan's rejection. However, despite being rejected, they didn't seem surprised. Instead, they seemed to have expected this outcome and were just a little disappointed. Yuan Venerate Mo sighed. I knew it would be like this. I know Venerate Hao too well. He would definitely try his best to invite that person before us. Now, it seems like that person has indeed accepted his invitation. Mo Zun chuckled. Though I knew it, without this test, how could I be certain that this is the case? Yuan Venerate Mo also smiled. That's right. Now that we've confirmed that the person Venerate Hao invited is that person, everything will be easy. Although that person has the strength of a level 9 pseudo-saint, he is only a level 4 pseudo-saint. He isn't a big threat to us. Venerate Mo smiled. That's right. I just hope that Venerate Hao won't go crazy like before. Luo Fan naturally didn't know that Yuan Venerate Mo and Yuan Venerate Mo had actually rejected him because he had already accepted Venerate Hao's invitation. At this moment, he had already thrown the matter of the Dharma discussion to the back of his mind. He was chatting and laughing with Cauldron Spirit while hurrying towards the miraculous scene of heaven and earth turning upside down. Compared to the Tao discussion that would only be held 1,000 years later, the most important thing for him now was to see more wonders of heaven and earth and experience more natural scenes that he had never felt or seen before. Then, he would integrate the many mysteries revealed by them into his worldview of laws, so that his worldview of laws would continue to be enriched. Luo Fan had already seen the essence of his cultivation and understood that everything else was just a supplement to his worldview of laws. As long as his worldview of laws could continue to grow and become complete, he would be able to attain the origin Tao fruit and become a sage when his worldview could support a perfect world. Chapter 1380. The area where the sky and earth were turned upside down was extremely vast. It even included a large stretch of sea with countless islands within it. Cauldron Spirit Boy couldn't help but cry out when he saw the spectacle in front of him. Is this the inversion of the sky and earth? How strange! At this moment, Luo Fan and Cauldron Spirit Boy were standing in front of a stretch of sea. This stretch of sea was strange and unfathomable. The sky and the surface of the sea had completely swapped positions. Where there was originally a sky, there was now a boundless sea. Where there was originally a sea, there was now a deep and unfathomable starry sky. The place where Luo Fan and Cauldron Spirit Boy were standing was right in front of that starry sky. Beneath their feet, there was originally a huge amount of seawater that had suddenly disappeared in an extremely strange manner. The boundless starry sky also appeared in an extremely strange manner. The entire process didn't involve any changes in spacetime. The laws and principles of the demon realm didn't change at all. It simply looked as if this was a completely normal sea. Luo Fan's gaze swept across, and he clearly saw the actual situation of this area of the sea. There were all kinds of living beings on the islands in this stretch of sea. These creatures were also tirelessly trying to survive, just like those on the islands outside the sea. The cultivators were also calmly cultivating, just like they were in an ordinary sea. If it wasn't for the fact that the sky and earth in front of him seemed to have been turned upside down, he might have thought that this stretch of land was completely normal. What a marvelous spectacle! I've really made the right decision to come here, Luo Fan praised at this moment. With that, he lifted his foot and took a light stride, crossing the boundary of the spectacle and crashing into the sea where the sky and earth were turned upside down. The instant he crashed into the boundary, an indescribable feeling of falling suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The feeling of falling was incomparably intense. He felt as if he had fallen hundreds of millions of miles in an instant. As the surrounding light and shadow changed, he found himself standing in front of the sea again. In front of him was the same scene of the sky and earth being turned upside down. However, compared to what he had seen before, this scene of heaven and earth turning upside down was many times larger. Cauldron Spirit Boy was hovering in the air above the upside-down sea a line away from him. He was right next to Cauldron Spirit. Although compared to before, he had only taken a very ordinary step. But if one were to measure the distance between Luo Fan and Cauldron Spirit in a straight line, it would be millions and millions of miles apart. At this moment, Cauldron Spirit's mouth was wide open as he looked at Han Shuo in disbelief. His eyes were filled with shock. "What are you waiting for?" Luo Fan frowned and said indifferently. Hearing this, Cauldron Spirit hastily acknowledged as though he had just woken up from a dream. He took a step forward and similarly crossed the boundary of the upside-down heaven and earth phenomenon. With this step, Luo Fan was able to clearly see what had happened to him after his previous step. Cauldron Spirit's figure blurred for a moment without causing any spacetime ripples. In fact, any changes in the layer of laws had already reached his side. When Cauldron Spirit came back to his senses, his face was filled with bewilderment. One could even say that he was at a loss. Evidently, such a change had exceeded his imagination. At the very least, it was beyond his imagination at this moment. Cauldron Spirit Boy mumbled, "What's going on? Why would there be such a change?" At this moment, he seemed to be itching to give it a try. He took a step forward. Once again, he crossed the boundary of the upside-down heaven and earth phenomenon. His figure disappeared in an instant. When he reappeared, he was already in front of him, above the originally normal sea. He was once again several tens of thousands of miles away from Luo Fan. Then, Cauldron Spirit Boy took another step and returned to Luo Fan's side. He did this again and again, sometimes over, and sometimes over. Just like this, he kept repeating it, but he was having a lot of fun playing. Luo Fan didn't care about how Cauldron Spirit Boy was having fun. He spread out his own perception and carefully sensed the boundary of the upside-down world, carefully comprehending the mysteries contained within. It was very normal for the world to be upside down. With his current abilities, he could create millions of such things with just a thought. However, if that was the case, it would definitely involve distorting space and distorting the rules and laws. In comparison, the upside-down world before him did not involve these changes at all. To Luo Fan, this was like opening a brand new door in front of him, making him feel as though he had discovered a whole new world. Just as Luo Fan was carefully observing and sensing the mysteries of the boundary of the upside-down world, a voice sounded in his ear. "Fellow cultivator, you won't be able to discover the mysteries within by doing this." Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He discovered that the source of the sound was a cultivator on an island that was more than 100 million kilometers away from here. This cultivator was a level 8 pseudo-sage cultivator. His aura was extremely powerful. It did not dissipate wantonly, nor was it completely restrained. Instead, it was in a balance between dissipating and restrained. It enveloped the island, causing everything on the island to be completely permeated by his aura, turning the entire island into his aura domain. It was even to the extent that Luo Fan was even able to notice that his aura had actually transformed into various strange living beings on the isle, and they mixed together with the various ordinary living beings that lived on the isle. He made friends with ordinary living beings, became enemies with ordinary living beings, fought with ordinary living beings, schemed against ordinary living beings, tasted love, reproduced, and so on and so forth. He was simply like an ordinary living being. This method of using aura was extremely exquisite. It was a wonderful method that Luo Fan had never seen before. This caused Luo Fan to lose a lot of interest in the mysteries of this natural wonder. Instead, he became more interested in this level 8 pseudo-sage cultivator. He smiled and said, "Thank you for reminding me, fellow cultivator. I'm Luo Fan, may I know your name?" The level 8 pseudo-sage cultivator had spoken to him from hundreds of millions of miles away. It was obvious that he had seen many cultivators like him, and he definitely had something to say. Just as Luo Fan was speaking, the void not far in front of him slightly distorted. Then, the figure of a fat middle-aged man appeared in front of him. This middle-aged man had a bloated figure. The smile on his face was extremely benevolent, and there was even a hint of honesty in it. After seeing Luo Fan, he smiled and bowed. "I'm Du Hanzi, greet fellow cultivator." Luo Fan returned the greeting and said, "So it's fellow cultivator Du Hanzi. Fellow cultivator said that I can't sense the mysteries of this place just by sensing it. What should I do to obtain the mysteries? I hope fellow cultivator can give me some pointers." If he caught a random person and asked him what he could do to obtain the mysteries, that would naturally be a little abrupt and rude. However, Do Hanzi had already interjected and brought up this topic, so it was extremely normal for him to take advantage of the situation to ask. It did not feel abrupt at all. As expected, Du Hanzi did not show any dissatisfaction because of Luo Fan's question. He only smiled and said, "This place of heaven and earth inversion appeared billions of years ago. Since ancient times there have been legends that this place was formed naturally, and there were also legends that it was created by a sage. There were all kinds of legends, but no one could tell what the truth was. However, no matter what method it appeared in, the profoundness of this natural wonder was profound and unfathomable. Almost no one was able to discover its profoundness. Even a level 9 venerable would find it difficult to detect it. I can see that fellow cultivator is extremely powerful, but you're not a level 9 venerable, so I made a bold guess. I hope fellow cultivator can forgive me." Luo Fan came to a sudden realization after hearing this. He smiled and said, "I see. Fellow cultivator's eyes are like torches. I really can't sense anything. I was quite frustrated before, but I didn't expect this natural wonder to have such a background. It's only normal that I can't sense anything. It's all thanks to fellow cultivator's reminder that I came to my senses. Otherwise, I don't know how long it would take for me to recover." At this moment, Cauldron's spirit was still constantly crossing the boundary of the natural wonder and seemed to be having a great time. Luo Fan saw Du Hanzi's somewhat curious gaze and said with a smile, "This is my magic treasure, Cauldron Spirit. I hope fellow cultivator can forgive me for being a little naughty." Du Hanzi's smile remained unchanged after hearing this, but he was secretly awed. Although he couldn't see through Cauldron Spirit, he knew that it was an extremely powerful magic treasure. In terms of grade, it was at least half a grade lower than him. In other words, this magic treasure was at least a level 8 pseudo-sage treasure. If such a magic treasure were in the hands of an ordinary person, it wouldn't pose any threat to him at all. But in the hands of this level 5 pseudo-sage treasure, the strength it could display was not much weaker than his own. It was already enough to pose a great threat to him. No wonder this person was so confident and dared to address him as fellow cultivator instead of senior. At this moment, the slight dissatisfaction he felt from Luo Fan calling him fellow cultivator had completely disappeared. The smile on his face became increasingly genuine. How sharp was Luo Fan's perception? He instantly discovered the change in Du Hanzi's smile. His heart moved, and he immediately knew what was going on. For a moment, he was somewhat helpless. Who would have thought that he would have to rely on Cauldron Spirit to gain the acknowledgement of others? This was just like a dog owner who had to rely on his dog to gain the acknowledgement of others as someone on the same level as him. It made him feel helpless. Du Hanzi smiled and said, "So it's fellow cultivator's magic treasure. It's indeed mysterious. This isn't a good place to talk. Why don't you have a seat in my residence?" The strength that Luo Fan could currently display was not much weaker than an ordinary level 9 pseudo-sage. If he added the power of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, the strength he could display would be comparable to a level 9 pseudo-sage who had condensed a divine will. With such strength, even if that level 8 pseudo-sage Du Hanzi had any tricks up his sleeves, even if he directly entered Du Hanzi's residence, Du Hanzi would absolutely not be able to harm him. It was impossible for him to scheme against him. Under such circumstances, he naturally wouldn't mind having a seat in Du Hanzi's residence. Therefore, he smiled faintly and said, "I've long been interested in your residence." When Du Hanzi heard this, he laughed and said, "Please?" Luo Fan smiled faintly. With a thought, Cauldron Spirit received Luo Fan's will. It stopped moving, turned around, and turned into a heavenly cauldron of the divine court and entered Luo Fan's body, completely disappearing without a trace. At this point, Luo Fan and Du Hanzi stepped out at the same time. In the blink of an eye, they traversed hundreds of millions of miles and arrived above the island that Du Hanzi previously left from. They entered the aura domain. Since Luo Fan had said that he was interested in Du Hanzi's aura domain, Du Hanzi naturally knew what to do. After entering the range of the island, he slowed down his speed and slowly walked with Luo Fan to his cave residence in the center of the island, so that Luo Fan could see the situation inside the island more clearly. He observed the interactions between the various aura beings and the ordinary living beings on the island. Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim in admiration, "Such control of aura is truly superb." Du Hanzi smiled and said, "It's just a little trick. I don't have any powerful inheritance, and I have to fumble through my own cultivation. I can only come up with such a foolish method to refine my aura. I've made a fool of myself." "You're too modest. I've never seen such an exquisite method of refining aura. This method can use the power of the living beings to refine the impurities in one's aura, allowing the spirituality of one's aura to grow continuously. It's absolutely exquisite." Luo Fan naturally wasn't stingy with his praise at this time. In fact, this method of refining aura indeed made him sigh in admiration. After all, this method of refining aura was quite enlightening to him. Just this alone was enough to make him sigh in admiration. Although Du Hanzi was modest on the surface, he was still proud of his method. Otherwise, Otherwise, he wouldn't have displayed it so openly and let all passers-by see its mysteries. Hearing Luo Fan's praise, he was quite happy. His attitude towards Luo Fan also became more and more friendly. Compared to the islands that Luo Fan had been to before, this island could only be considered a very, very small island. Its area was actually only tens of millions of miles. Compared to the island he was on before, which was so vast that he couldn't even see the end of it. Compared to the island that was hundreds of millions of kilometers wide, it was really insignificant. But, although it was narrow, however, there were hundreds of countries on this island. Moreover, the strength of these countries themselves was not any weaker than the countries on the islands that Luo Fan had experienced back then. Vaguely, the strength of the upper echelons of these countries even surpassed them. Due to the presence of Du Hanzi's aura, the civilization on this island was developing in a direction that was different from any civilization that Luo Fan had ever seen. The creatures on the island were very calm towards all extraordinary items. When it came to giving birth to something messy, it didn't care. He could also face it calmly. For them, reproduction was like this. No matter what the parents were, your offspring could be any other creature. For example, 2 ordinary mortals could give birth to a divine dragon. It was also possible to give birth to a divine tiger, and it was even more possible to give birth to a powerful immortal who was born with the ability to fly in the sky and burrow underground. As for the 2 immortals, they might even have given birth to a mouse. In the eyes of the outside world, any one of these things would be enough to scare the living daylights out of them. But on this island, it became the norm. It became something that everyone thought was normal, something that everyone could face with indifference. The mortals might not be able to tell what the truth was, and felt that it was natural for them to be like this. But Luo Fan could tell at a glance that this was the result of Du Hanzi's aura. Almost half of the living beings on the island were formed from Du Hanzi's aura. These creatures formed from Du Hanzi's aura did not appear out of thin air. Instead, they entered this island in a way similar to reincarnation, and merged with the other creatures. The offspring of those creatures were almost all creatures formed by Du Hanzi's aura. Every time these auras reincarnated, their original will that belonged to Du Hanzi would be completely suppressed, and their consciousness would become completely blank. Like ordinary babies, they would receive the education of their parents, and gradually grow a new will and a new consciousness from that blank space. Then, with this new will and consciousness, they would welcome their new life, grow like ordinary creatures, and finally die like ordinary creatures, turning back into an aura and returning to Du Hanzi. Then, Du Hanzi would let out another wisp of aura, and reincarnate again. Once again, it would become blank, be born again, and grow again. Die again. Just like that, the cycle went on, never ending, and after each wisp of aura experienced such a life, it would become a little more condensed, and a little more agile because it had been tempered by all kinds of things in the mortal world. Just like this, thousands of wisps of aura fused together, and naturally, Du Hanzi's aura began to grow with every moment. The current Du Hanzi was only a grade 8 pseudo-sage. However, his aura was already close to the limit of a grade 8 pseudo-sage, and there were already signs of him breaking through the boundary of a grade 8 pseudo-sage and stepping into a grade 9 pseudo-sage. While looking at the various wonders on the island that were even more bizarre than the world outside, Luo Fan and Du Hanzi soon arrived at his cave abode. This cave abode was different from the ones that ordinary cultivators usually sat in. It was another space that was opened up. Instead, it directly built a space out of thin air with aura. And in this space, there were many creatures. These were all creatures formed by Du Hanzi's aura. When Luo Fan and Du Hanzi arrived at the entrance of the cave abode, a few grade 1 pseudo-sages formed by Du Hanzi's aura came out to greet them. They naturally bowed to Du Hanzi and Luo Fan. To Du Hanzi, they called him master. But to Luo Fan, they called him senior. Looking at the appearance of these auras, Luo Fan's face finally showed a look of shock for the first time. He looked at Du Hanzi and found that there was a faint smile on Du Hanzi's face. It seemed to be a little proud, but also a little helpless. When Luo Fan saw this, he finally understood what was going on. For a moment, his emotions became complicated. He felt both funny and amused. There was also an inexplicable sense of admiration. Du Hanzi had obviously evolved his aura into various creatures and participated in the interaction between the living beings on this island for a very, very long time. At least, it was calculated in trillions of years. In such a long period of time, even if it took millions of years, only one living being with aura would be able to break through the limits of ordinary living beings, obtain longevity through cultivation, and never die. By now, there must have been an extremely large number of immortals with aura, and most of these creatures with aura that obtained immortality would probably be in all kinds of conflict. All kinds of lives that were lost in all kinds of adventures would return to the original cycle that Du Hanzi had set, turning into aura and returning to his aura, becoming resources to promote his aura to improve. But, of course, there would also be some creatures with aura that would constantly improve and grow in the process, eventually breaking through one realm after another, and eventually even growing to the level of pseudo-saint. For Du Hanzi, such creatures with aura, although they were constantly growing and strengthening, constantly turning into traces of aura of this creature, they would still not die. However, because it didn't die, no matter how strong it grew, it wouldn't be able to benefit Du Hanzi much. On the contrary, because of the existence of these auras, it would start to draw his own aura, causing him to feel more and more pressure. Luo Fan thought to himself that if he encountered such a situation, he would definitely personally erase these creatures with auras when they grew to a certain level, extract the essence of their auras, and integrate it into his own aura, regardless of the wishes of these auras themselves. And Du Hanzi obviously did not do it in the way that Luo Fan had expected. He allowed these cultivators with auras to exist, and even took them in as disciples, teaching them cultivation, and actually allowing them to continuously grow and improve their realms. This kind of broad-mindedness, this kind of boldness, was beyond imagination. In fact, what Luo Fan found funny was that Du Hanzi's method of nurturing auras, in the end, became such a situation where he could not do anything about it. And what he admired was Du Hanzi's broad-mindedness. Chapter 1381. Luo Fan saw that although Du Hanzi had a bitter smile on his face, there was not much helplessness in his eyes. Instead, he seemed to be quite satisfied. It was obvious that he was not as helpless as he said he was towards these cultivators who were reincarnated from his aura. In fact, he was even happy to see them succeed. Luo Fan did not say much about this. He just smiled and let it go. They entered the cave dwelling. This cave dwelling was formed from aura, and it was extremely vast. After sitting down, Luo Fan asked, "Why did you open a cave dwelling here? The cultivation environment here is not too good." Du Hanzi smiled. "Just like what you did before, I wanted to completely find out where the secret of this wonder of heaven and earth lies. Unfortunately, after billions of years, my cultivation level has increased from the original level 4 pseudo-sage to the current level 8 pseudo-sage. Unfortunately, I still did not gain anything." Luo Fan smiled. "No wonder you advised me to give up before." Du Hanzi smiled. "Perhaps, in the future, you might think that you have lost the opportunity to understand the wonder of this wonder of yours." Luo Fan shook his head and sighed. "Why would I be so arrogant? What you have failed to do for billions of years, I know that I have no chance of succeeding." Du Hanzi only smiled and changed the topic. As cultivators, it was natural for them to talk about cultivation and share their own cultivation paths with each other. Luo Fan and Du Hanzi were naturally the same. In the next 3 years, Du Hanzi roughly explained his own understanding of the Tao of Aura to Luo Fan, allowing Luo Fan to have a deeper understanding of the Tao of Aura. He faintly felt that he had taken another step forward in the use of aura. It seemed that he could control aura to do many things that he could not do before. In return for a plum, Du Hanzi shared his path of cultivation. Luo Fan naturally would not be stingy. However, he naturally could not directly share his fundamental worldview of cultivation. Chapter 1390 Chapter All the Magic Treasures in the World. As long as there is any book in this world, given enough time, I can directly get it for you to read. Therefore, if you have any questions that have nothing to do with cultivation, you can ask me. I will definitely give you an answer. At this time, Cultivation Wisdom vowed solemnly. However, its words could only be considered a little exaggerated at most, and it could not be considered completely false. When Luo Fan first refined this book, he had indeed given it the ability to collect all the words in the world, all the books. According to this ability, in theory, it could indeed collect any book that existed in the boundless demon realm and turn it into a part of this book, allowing people to read it at will. However, it was obvious that although this was the case in theory, but if one really wanted this magic tool to collect all the books and copy them into this book, it would take an unimaginably long time. It might not even be possible in 100 billion years or even 1,000,000,000,000 years. If one had to wait for so many years just to see a specific book, it would obviously be faster to directly ask around. However, Cauldron's spirit did not think too much about it. He was overjoyed when he heard Cultivation Wisdom's boast. He started chatting with Cultivation Wisdom in a low voice. Chapter 1382. On this day, Luo Fan arrived at an island. This island was extremely vast. Luo Fan was willing to believe that it was a continent in the demon realm. Such an island blocked Luo Fan's path. On the island, there were many powerful auras occupying it. Among these auras, there was no lack of pseudo-sacred rank auras. There was even an aura that had reached the 9th tier pseudo-sacred rank. There was not a single mortal on this island. There were only cultivators on the island. Some were strong, some were weak. These cultivators occupied various places on the island and established residence after residence, turning the entire island into a world of cultivators. It was Luo Fan's first time seeing such an island. He secretly recalled the information he obtained from Du Hanzi. He could not help but feel somewhat disappointed when he learned that this wasn't the place for the qualification test to participate in the doctrine discussion. If this was the place for the test, then he wouldn't be surprised at all. Since it wasn't, it meant that he had to continue advancing, just as Luo Fan was about to cross over the island. Suddenly, a surge of power descended from the sky, directly blasting towards him. This force contained powerful laws and precepts. Even time and space seemed to be altered by this force. It produced an extremely strange and inconceivable distortion. Before Luo Fan could say anything, Cauldron's spirit suddenly roared, "Good heavens! How dare you launch a sneak attack?" As he spoke, he suddenly raised his hand and fiercely slapped towards the direction where the force came from. This slap did not produce any special undulations, but there was naturally a wave of strange changes that directly affected the power. In an instant, the strange laws and precepts contained within the force disintegrated. The force was completely shattered. At this moment, a strange cry was suddenly heard from below. Following this cry, a strange mystic light shot up from a certain mountain peak on the island below. It revealed a colorful silhouette in the void. It seemed as though heaven and earth were rejoicing over something and were welcoming the arrival of someone. At this moment, Luo Fan's thoughts spun like lightning, and he already understood what was going on. That power just now was definitely some sort of rule setting on the island itself, or some sort of strange formation. The reason for its existence was to force all cultivators who passed by the island to obey some sort of rule. He might not be able to fly too fast, or he might not be able to fly too high, or he might not even be able to fly over it, and so on. Just now, Cauldron's spirit boy had instantly shattered the energy and dispelled the law. This was definitely to make the testing law think that a level 9 pseudo-sacred level existence had passed by. That was why it displayed such a welcoming scene. Of course, perhaps this kind of welcoming scene was also a way to force him to not leave directly. Soon, cultivators flew up from various parts of the island and looked towards Luo Fan's location. Most of these cultivators were below the pseudo-sacred realm. However, many of them were at the pseudo-saint level. The cultivators looked at Luo Fan and the others with curiosity in their eyes. However, none of them came forward to speak. Cauldron Spirit Boy had never seen such a scene before. He was at a loss for a moment. At this moment, Cultivation Wisdom, who had been tormented miserably by Cauldron Spirit Boy, couldn't help but gloat. Hee hee, you've caused trouble. Look at how covetously they're eyeing us. They must be planning to attack us. You've provoked so many enemies. Let's see how Master will punish you. Cauldron Spirit Boy trembled. However, he still instinctively retorted, how is that possible? I think they're clearly here to welcome us. Cultivation Wisdom chuckled again. They don't even know us. Why would they come to welcome us? Luo Fan knitted his brows as he looked at the crowd of cultivators in front of him. He knew that the mastermind of this matter had yet to appear. However, he wasn't in a hurry and just quietly hovered in the air. After a while, a beam of light shot out from somewhere on the island. The location where this beam of light shot out from was not at the same time as the place where the various multicolored lights were shot out. Instead, they were quite a distance apart. The two could even be said to be located at the two edges of the island. It was so huge that Luo Fan even thought it was a continent. This beam of light came at an extremely fast speed. In the blink of an eye, it had already manifested in front of Luo Fan. It was a cultivator who had the appearance of an elderly man. This elderly man had a steely expression and a few strands of long black beard were attached to his chin. As he hovered in the air, he naturally exuded an old-fashioned and strict aura. Most importantly, this elderly man was a level 9 pseudo-saint. After the elderly man stood still, he bowed and indifferently said, "Welcome to my Spiritualist Island, fellow cultivators." Spiritualist Island? Luo Fan knitted his brows. This name was rather strange. Spiritualist was not a method of cultivation, but a cultivator who was a living being without a physical body. There was a huge difference between these cultivators and ordinary cultivators of flesh and blood at the lower levels. They were at a great disadvantage, but they also had quite a big advantage. However, this was only at the lower levels. As long as a cultivator could reach the pure Yang Tai stage, this disparity would no longer exist. Since this was the case, why was this island where the majority of the cultivators had already surpassed the pure Yang Tai stage, why was it called the Spiritualist Island? Of course, despite his doubts, Luo Fan did not show any lack of manners on the surface. He and Cauldron Spirit returned the greeting at the same time. Then, Cauldron Spirit said to Luo Fan, "I am Luo Fan. How should I address you, fellow cultivator?" The moment he opened his mouth, it became clear who was the leader between him and Cauldron Spirit. When the level 9 pseudo-saint heard Luo Fan speak, he slightly creased his brows and said, "I am Reverend Xing. May I know why you two have come to my Spiritualist Island?" Luo Fan smiled. "We are just passing by. This is my first time visiting your island, and I do not know the rules of your island. I hope Reverend Xing will forgive me if I have offended you." Ever since Luo Fan had cultivated a holy decree, he no longer addressed any other level 9 pseudo-saints as seniors. This was because, in his opinion, level 9 pseudo-saints no longer had the lofty status they once had. In a situation where the other party didn't have a high and mighty status, Luo Fan couldn't do such a thing. Even if this might make the other party dissatisfied. Even if they were angry, Luo Fan would never change his way of doing things. Reverend Xing became even more dissatisfied when he heard Luo Fan's words. To him, although Luo Fan's status was extraordinary and he even had a level 9 pseudo-saint protecting him, He was still not a level 9 pseudo-saint. How could he be qualified to address him as fellow cultivator? Reverend Xing couldn't help but coldly snort. The spiritualist island welcomes all foreign cultivators. However, all outsiders must abide by the rules of the spiritualist island. They must be restricted by the island's rules, such as flying speed and altitude. They must follow the flight route and not stray. Just now, you dispersed the power of laws of the island. You have already violated the rules. I hope that you will receive your punishment at the island's punishment hall. When Luo Fan heard this, his face revealed an even more incredulous look. Receive punishment? Disperse the power of laws? Did this Reverend Xing know what he was talking about? Before Luo Fan could speak, Cauldron's spirit angrily shouted, "Hey! Old man! What nonsense are you spouting? You want us to go to your shitty punishment hall to receive punishment? Who do you think you are?" Reverend Xing's expression remained unchanged as he coldly replied, "If you don't want to receive punishment, then you can. Fight your way out of our spiritualist island then." Fellow Taoist Xing, this is only a small matter. Do you really want to turn hostile? Luo Fan plainly asked. Reverend Xing's way of doing things was truly strange and overbearing. For a moment, Luo Fan couldn't figure out what Reverend Xing was thinking. Reverend Xing coldly replied, "The rules of the spiritualist island are supreme. Anyone who violates the rules must be punished. Even if you are an outsider, you are no exception." Luo Fan suddenly somewhat understood why this island was called the spiritualist island. Spirit cultivators. Spirit cultivators were indispensable in any world. After all, living beings would leave behind their souls after death. If ghosts set foot on the path of cultivation, they would be spirit cultivators. And any world would have living beings. When there were so many living beings, there would naturally be some who, by chance, set foot on the path of cultivation after death, and thus become spirit cultivators. And this was only one of the sources of spirit cultivators. Apart from that, there were also many strange races born from the heavens and the earth. They were also another source of spirit cultivators. The number of living beings in the demon realm was so large that it couldn't even be clearly described by numbers. It was so vast that it was difficult to describe. All kinds of strange races were born in it, and the number of spirit cultivators that might exist in it could be imagined. Spirit cultivators, on the other hand, were no different from ordinary cultivators of flesh and blood after they reached the primordial pure yang realm. But before that, they had a huge weakness. After they were subdued, they could be turned into resources, materials for refining treasures, or elixirs that could enhance souls. Because of this, the living conditions of spirit cultivators before they reached the primordial pure yang realm could not be said to be difficult, but it was definitely considered as bad. And a bad living condition was very likely to create an extraordinary sense of self-esteem. This kind of pride could make those spirit cultivators become sensitive and harsh, and they would easily overreact to all possible offenses against them. Judging by this situation, Reverend Xing was very likely such a spirit cultivator with such a strong self-esteem. Therefore, it was easy to imagine why this island was called the Island of Spirit Cultivators. After roughly guessing the reason, Luo Fan lost the will to argue with Reverend Xing unless he could put himself in an extremely low position and go to the so-called punishment hall to receive punishment according to Reverend Xing's wishes. No matter what he said, it would only make Reverend Xing angrier and make Reverend Xing even more hostile. And it was obvious that Luo Fan couldn't go to the punishment hall to receive punishment, even if Reverend Xing couldn't punish him too harshly. Hence, it was obvious that the conflict between the two of them was irreconcilable. After letting out a sigh, Luo Fan said, "If that's the case, then I'll have to offend you." With that, Cauldron's spirit faintly shook and turned into a heavenly divine court cauldron in midair. Then, it circled towards Reverend Xing, intending to put him into the heavenly divine court cauldron. Both the speed and the trajectory of the heavenly divine court cauldron were beyond imagination. Normally speaking, millions of worlds could be sucked into the heavenly divine court cauldron. However, Reverend Xing was a level 9 pseudo-sacred level being after all. How could he be sucked in so easily? Reverend Xing revealed a look of astonishment when he saw Cauldron Spirit's transformation. Evidently, he couldn't tell that Cauldron Spirit was a treasure spirit of a magic treasure. However, as the heavenly divine court cauldron circled towards him, Reverend Xing revealed a cold smile. An enormous net suddenly shot out from the back of his head and spread out in the air, wrapping around the heavenly divine court cauldron. Although the mesh of this giant net was sparse, it seemed to be even tighter than a real sealed object. Even space and time were tightly sealed. Even space and time seemed to be unable to escape the seal of this net. At this moment, Luo Fan thought of a saying, "Heaven's net grinds slowly, but nothing escapes." As expected of Reverend Xing. To think that he'd condensed the laws to such a degree. He couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. Any level 9 pseudo-sacred level being was indeed extraordinary. Even this weird-looking level 9 pseudo-sacred level being with a twisted ego was no exception. However, even though this heavenly net was a level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, it was only on the same level as the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. If it was the heavenly cauldron of the divine court that had cut corners earlier, it might not have been able to resist the heavenly net at all and would have been caught directly. However, the heavenly cauldron of the divine court was completely different now. Under the influence of those holy wills, not only had his foundation been completely made up for, it had also been greatly strengthened. The heavenly net was about to come. The heavenly cauldron shook slightly. In the blink of an eye, millions upon millions of worlds surged out of the cauldron, filling the sky and covering the earth as they shot toward the heaven net. These worlds were absolutely chaotic worlds. In those worlds, there was no such thing as the relationship between father and son, or the principles of a ruler and his subjects. There were no laws or regulations. These worlds all gave off auras that were completely different from the heaven's net. Their very existence was already disrupting the heaven's net's foundation, and billions of worlds rushed out at the same time, colliding with the heaven's net. In an instant, the heavenly net shook violently. The power of the laws contained within it was rapidly being depleted. The power that sealed everything was gradually being depleted during this process. Seeing this, Zun Xing nodded. His expression changed drastically. This was the first time he had encountered such an attack. The power of a level 9 pseudo-sage was almost at the peak of the sage realm. As a magic treasure, because it was not restricted by the physical body, it could exert even more power. He had never encountered a world attack like this that could affect the power of his heaven's net. He shouted softly. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. Long rivers rushed out of the top of his head and suddenly poured into the heaven's net. Those long rivers were the rivers of law and order. If the laws were placed in any mortal world, in any mortal country, even the most primitive of countries, they would be able to continuously grow under the protection of these laws. In the end, they would even surpass the limits of the world, and become the greatest and most famous country in the universe that Luo Fan had ever seen. Now that these rivers of laws poured into the heaven's net instantly lit up. In an instant, the billions of worlds that had surged out of the heaven's net were completely enveloped within it. With a sudden twist, all the laws seeped into those billions of worlds. In the blink of an eye, those billions of worlds became orderly. All the relationships between father and son, the principles of a ruler and his subjects, and the laws and regulations were instantly determined. The aura that those worlds emitted was completely opposite to the heaven's net. However, it gradually became the same as the heaven's net. Instead, it greatly strengthened the power of the heaven's net and made it even more powerful. It directly covered the sky. When Luo Fan saw this, he could not help but exclaim, "Great technique! To be able to instantly change the chaos of billions of worlds and turn billions of chaotic worlds into absolute order, The power of this magic treasure was much greater than he had imagined. However, although he was exclaiming, Luo Fan obviously had no plans to admit defeat. While he was thinking this, the divine court sky cauldron shook and produced an extremely strong suction force. At the same time, an indescribably chaotic power was emitted from it. This suction force was targeted at the heaven's net. It used a forceful method to suck the heaven's net into it, while the chaotic power used a tempting method to lure the heaven's net into it. The two complemented each other, producing a huge effect. In an instant, the heaven's net began to sink into the mouth of the divine court sky cauldron and began to drill into the mouth of the divine court sky cauldron. Xing Zun's face fell. He bellowed. The billions of worlds that had been changed by the heaven's net directly formed a sword of laws and regulations in the void. It turned into a blade light and entered the divine court sky cauldron through the suction force. This sword was formed from billions of worlds, so the power contained within it was so strong that even a level 9 pseudo-saint would have a hard time resisting it. This was because the power of order and the power of laws and regulations were linked together. The power of laws and regulations continued to strengthen and improve. Although it was only a short distance from the heaven's net to the divine court sky cauldron, the power of the sword had already increased by more than 10 times. When the sword rushed into the divine court sky cauldron, the suction force of the divine court sky cauldron dissipated. Then, a terrifying explosion erupted in the divine court sky cauldron. Amidst the explosion, the power of laws and regulations surged, directly neutralizing the indescribable chaos that had been emanating from the mouth of the cauldron. Soon, everything dissipated. The divine court sky cauldron floated in midair, and the heaven's net was facing it from a distance. Within it, nothing else happened. Xing Zun couldn't help but praise at this time, "What a good treasure." Luo Fan also praised, "Fellow Taoists, heaven's net isn't bad either. It has the essence of the heaven's net." Xing Zun said indifferently, "Since you know this is the heaven's net, you should know. Before you admit your guilt and receive punishment, I won't stop." Luo Fan shook his head and sighed, "Although I admire fellow Taoists' heaven's net, I didn't say that I couldn't resist it." As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed. The divine court sky cauldron suddenly enlarged and pressed down on Xing Zun. What was the greatest use of the cauldron? It wasn't sucking, spitting, or boiling. It was suppressing. Suppressing. No matter how strong and strict the heaven's net was, it could only be effective within a certain range. Before one obtained the highest ruling position, no matter how good the laws and regulations were, they would only be suppressed by the ruler. And Luo Fan's divine court sky cauldron was the embodiment of a ruler even higher than Xing Zun. It directly used a tyrannical method to suppress Xing Zun, completely disregarding how strict and strong his laws and regulations were. Under such suppression, Xing Zun's expression changed. The river of laws and regulations gushed out from his head once again, pouring into the heaven's net. As the river of laws and regulations poured in, the heaven's net changed, turning into a giant axe that slashed at the divine court sky cauldron. Laws and regulations weren't just a net. They could also be turned into violence. Laws and regulations that couldn't be turned into a net weren't complete laws and regulations. Laws and regulations that couldn't be turned into violence weren't laws and regulations that could exist for long. The axe formed by the heaven's net was extremely huge and powerful. The power of laws and regulations wrapped around it constantly condensed the surrounding laws and regulations, as well as the power of time and space. It even vaguely evolved into millions of strange worlds, all of which turned into the power of the giant axe as it smashed towards the divine court sky cauldron. At this time, Luo Fan didn't change the attack of the divine court sky cauldron. Instead, he continued to activate the suppressive power of the divine court sky cauldron, completely ignoring the attack of the giant axe as it directly and domineeringly suppressed it. Suppression, in the first place, required endless tyranny. It required absolute decisiveness. If it wasn't decisive and domineering enough, then it would be like a rat in a dilemma. It wouldn't be of any use, and it might even hurt itself. Boom, 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 boom. A terrifying explosion erupted from the point of contact. At this moment, a powerful shock wave swept out in all directions, shattering the void and causing time to become chaotic. Even the huge island below was swept away by the shock wave and swept into the chaotic space-time fragments, disappearing from the sea. This island was protected by the boundless power of laws and regulations. Even though the shockwave was enough to destroy spacetime, it couldn't destroy it. However, the island itself could. Without the protection of the power of laws and regulations, the sea around the island wasn't as convenient. It was completely shattered and even swept away by the spacetime fragment. This caused the island to leave its original position along with the spacetime fragments. No! Xing Zun roared in horror. Chapter 1383. As a level 9 pseudo-saint, Xing Zun's strength went without saying. With this grab, his right hand passed through the countless spacetime fragments and was completely unaffected by the spacetime turbulence. He grabbed the island that was about to disappear into the space-time turbulence. At this moment, Luo Fan's divine quartz heaven cauldron had completely suppressed the giant axe. The giant axe turned into a heaven net that was pulled back and wrapped around Xing Zun. Xing Zun was suppressed in the void by the divine quartz heaven cauldron. He was like a mosquito trapped in a spider's web. No matter how he struggled, he couldn't break free from the suppression of the divine quartz heaven cauldron. Originally, if Luo Fan had wanted to, he could have directly used the will that he had cultivated, which was similar to a holy will but not a holy will. With a twist of his hand it would have been enough to split the level 9 pseudo-sage in front of him into millions of pieces and throw them into countless spaces. However, seeing Xing Zun ignore his body, his magic treasure, and Luo Fan's Heaven God Court cauldron and reach out to grab the island, Xing Zun couldn't bring himself to do it. He sighed and said, "Daoist Xing Zun, can we let this matter go?" Xing Zun frowned and said coldly, "Since you've won, of course you can say whatever you want." Luo Fan said helplessly, "Daoist Xing, don't make it sound like I started the fight. It was you who wanted to humiliate me. That's why I had to resist." Xing Zun didn't say anything. Although the island had been lifted by the impact of the battle and was about to sink into the space-time turbulence, the countless cultivators that lived on the island weren't injured. However, due to the effect of the formation on the island, none of the countless cultivators living on the island were injured. At this moment, they were only shocked when they were caught by Xing Zun. Xing Zun's behavior made Luo Fan very worried. Xing Zun was someone with a strong sense of pride. If he suddenly felt that what Luo Fan did to him was a greater insult, it would be a greater offense. If that was the case, he would be in even more trouble. As a level 9 false sage, the entire demon realm was actually not that big to him. Unless Luo Fan left the demon realm directly. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to escape his pursuit. Moreover, even if he could avoid being tracked, he wasn't willing to continue hiding like this. Therefore, the best thing to do was, of course, to resolve this matter completely. Xing Zun didn't say a word. She looked like a dead pig that wasn't afraid of boiling water. It made Luo Fan want to strangle her to death. It was a pity. After all, it was just a small matter. Strangling a Class 9 pseudo-sage to death over such a small matter was clearly a little too much. Luo Fan sighed, raised his hand, and the divine court heavenly cauldron shrank slightly. It returned to the top of his head, floating and sinking. Xing Zun was stunned when he was released by the heavenly cauldron. He looked at Luo Fan in disbelief and said, "You're actually willing to let me go? Don't you know that I will never let this go?" Luo Fan said helplessly, "I have to leave eventually. I can't always use this magic treasure to suppress you, right? Aren't you afraid that I'll continue to be stubborn?" Zun Xing didn't want to give up on this question. Luo Fan said indifferently, If fellow Taoist continues to be unyielding, then I will give it to you. I am confident that I will be able to suppress you again. However, if fellow Taoist refuses to give up, then I have no choice but to be ruthless. I hope fellow Taoist will consider it carefully. Xing Zun's expression changed slightly. Through the previous battle, he had already discovered that Luo Fan's cultivation realm was not even worth mentioning to him. However, after he grasped that magic treasure, his strength was beyond imagination. He might be able to withstand it for a short period of time, but after a long time, it would definitely be difficult for him to withstand it. Therefore, he knew that while Luo Fan's words were blunt, they were the truth. However, his cultivation path didn't allow him to give up on pursuing Luo Fan's violation of the island's rules. Therefore, he said, I am very impressed by your abilities. However, I cannot ignore the island's rules. If fellow Taoist is willing, we can use another method to resolve this. Luo Fan said helplessly, How do you plan to resolve this? You don't have to go to the punishment hall to be punished, but you will need to compensate the island with something, Zun Xing said. Luo Fan was even more helpless now. Compensation? Zun Xing said solemnly. Yes, you have violated the island's rules and damaged the island's foundation. If you don't want to be punished, then you can only compensate. Otherwise, no matter how strong you are, I will pursue this to the end. Hearing Zun Xing's words, Luo Fan smiled bitterly and said, What compensation? Let's hear it. He didn't want to waste any more time with Zun Xing. If Zun Xing's compensation wasn't too much, he was willing to pay that compensation in exchange for his own peace. Zun Xing said faintly, I don't need much. I just need a half-step false sage treasure. As a 9th-level venerable, fellow Taoist doesn't lack pseudo-sage magic treasures, right? Whether I lack it or not is one thing, whether you give it to me or not is another. Fine, fine, fine. I'm afraid of you. Looking at Zun Xing's dark expression, which was like an iron plate, Luo Fan finally gave in. He grabbed at the air and used the 2nd level of the law of causality. In an instant, the entire demon realm was filled with trillions of minute changes, and they quickly gathered in front of him. In the blink of an eye, they turned into a ring-shaped magic treasure. This magical treasure was extremely exquisite. It was a half-step pseudo-sacred treasure. Such a half-step pseudo-sage treasure was of little value even to a new pseudo-sage cultivator, let alone a pseudo-sage cultivator. Any level, one pseudo-sage cultivator could refine such a treasure in a short period of time if he wanted to. Under such circumstances, Zun Xing, a 9th-level pseudo-sage, actually wanted such a magic treasure. It was even to the extent that for the sake of this magic treasure, he would rather be entangled endlessly with an existence like Luo Fan that could easily suppress him without yielding. This was truly slightly unreasonable. Zun Xing took the magic treasure and inspected it carefully. After a close inspection, he said, Since you have this compensation, then I will let the matter of you breaking the laws of the island go. Hearing this, Luo Fan finally let out a sigh of relief. That's good, that's good. Since there's nothing else, I will take my leave. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Zun Xing raised his hand to stop Luo Fan. Wait! Luo Fan's body trembled. His body trembled as he asked, What is it now? I didn't cross your spirit cultivation island this time. I wanted to ask, are you going to participate in the Tao Discussions qualification test? Zun Xing asked. Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression changed. Was it that easy to see through? What do you mean by that? The qualification test for the Tao Discussion Dharma Assembly will be held in this region of the sea. I've seen a few pseudo-sage cultivators cross the Spirit Island in the past. Now that I see you heading in this direction, I have a guess. I wonder if you are here for that test? Luo Fan frowned. I see. I am indeed going to participate in the qualification test. What do you want to tell me? Zun Xing said, Thank you for protecting the Spirit Island's rules. I can't repay you, but I have a recommendation for you to participate in the Tao discussion. Are you interested? Luo Fan suddenly remembered that Yuan Venerate Haozuan and the others had also invited him to participate in the Tao discussion. What did their invitation have to do with Zun Xing's? For a moment, his brow furrowed. Over the past few days, I've been invited by a few level 9 venerates to participate in the Tao discussion. Almost at the same time. I wonder if there's any secret hidden in this. Can you explain it to me? Zun Xing's expression changed when he heard this. Obviously, he hadn't expected Luo Fan to have already accepted a level 9 pseudo-sage's invitation. This was almost certain. If a level 9 pseudo-sage had already invited him, why would he participate in the qualification test? Wouldn't he have just followed a level 9 pseudo-sage to the Tao discussion? Since you've already received an invitation from a level 9 venerate. I didn't say anything about that. Please do as you wish. He had no intention of replying to Luo Fan. Luo Fan frowned deeply as he looked at Zun Xing. Even an idiot would be able to tell that there was a secret behind it. If Zun Xing hadn't mentioned it, he wouldn't have thought much about it even if he knew. He wouldn't have taken it to heart. However, Zun Xing had already started, yet Luo Fan had actually stopped talking and ignored his question. This was simply challenging his patience. Zun Xing, I've already given you enough face, Zun Xing said indifferently. Xing Zun frowned. He naturally understood the meaning behind Luo Fan's words. Luo Fan was clearly saying that he had already given Luo Fan enough face, so Luo Fan should return the favor. Otherwise, I'll have to take back my face. This has nothing to do with you. This is the rule between us level 9 pseudo-sages. It's best if you don't interfere, Zun Xing said indifferently. Luo Fan laughed coldly. Although he thought that Zun Xing was unreasonable, he still respected his attitude towards the spiritual cultivation island. Hence, he didn't feel any ill will towards him. But now, right in front of him, Xing Zun was blatantly looking down on him. Xing Zun did not feel any gratitude towards him for letting Xing Zun go. This caused the hatred he had for Xing Zun to resurface again. Since he already felt ill, Luo Fan couldn't be bothered to suppress it anymore. I see, he said indifferently. Then, without waiting for Zun Xing to react, he raised his hand and pointed. With a thought, the heavenly cauldron shook violently. As though it transcended time and space, it disappeared from its original position. At the same time, it appeared above Zun Xing's head and pressed down on him. Zun Xing's expression changed. The heavenly net that was originally in his body shook violently and merged with the void. In an instant, his body turned illusory. It was as though he had left the demonic realm, this space, and this universe. Under normal circumstances, if one wanted to harm him, they would have to break through the universe first. Only by breaking through the barriers of time and space could this be done. During this process, he could have thought of other ways to block this attack and even counterattack. However, it was obvious. At this time, he wasn't facing an ordinary attack. It was an attack from a level 9 pseudo-sage treasure that had been infused with holy will. How could an ordinary level 9 pseudo-sage treasure compare to this kind of attack? In an instant, the unimaginable suppressive power seeped into the void. It penetrated through time and space, penetrated the universe, and directly acted on the illusory yet real Zun Xing. It was as though he was in another world, another universe, on Zun Xing's body. As this suppressive power pressed down, Zun Xing's body suddenly shook. A look of shock appeared on his face, and he couldn't help but scream. Then, he was once again enveloped by the suppressive power of the heavenly cauldron and appeared in the space-time in front of Luo Fan. He was directly suppressed by the heavenly cauldron on the nomological laws. He was like an ant being crushed by a mountain. His body kept cracking, as though he could completely collapse and be destroyed at any time. I wonder if fellow Taoist can tell me what's going on. What's your plan for recommending me to participate in the Tao discussion? Don't say that you don't have a plan. This kind of nonsense, I don't believe it no matter what, Luo Fan said indifferently. Compared to his battle with Zun Xing, his performance this time was unimaginably straightforward. It was as though he wasn't facing a level 9 pseudo-sage, but an ordinary mortal. Zun Xing struggled violently, and the power in his body surged. The nomological power on the heavenly net circulated rapidly, generating a powerful impact force. He wanted to directly break through the suppression of the heavenly cauldron. Just the shockwaves from the struggle alone were enough to shatter hundreds of thousands of layers of space within 100 feet of the divine court heavenly cauldron. The nomological laws became extremely chaotic. The 4 basic existences, time, space, matter, and energy, seemed to have returned to their original state of chaos. Everything became gray and hazy. However, within 100 feet of the heavenly cauldron, this struggle had no effect at all. Within this range, time and space were stable, and the nomological laws seemed to have become extremely sturdy. It was as though no force could shake it. As for the 4 basic existences, time, space, matter, and energy, they were so stable that they seemed to be eternally unchanging. It was easy to imagine how terrifying this terrifying suppression was. Xing Zun even used his own body. He wanted to turn his body into the power of laws and attack the heavenly cauldron of the divine court in a frenzy. However, the result was that no matter how he struggled or attacked, the heavenly cauldron did not budge at all. It seemed like his struggle was like an ant trying to shake a tree. After a long while, Zun Xing finally gave up on the idea of continuing to struggle. At this moment, he was only filled with shock. An indescribable shock. He was also a level 9 pseudo-sage who had participated in many Tao discussion meetings. The number of level 9 pseudo-sages he had seen was naturally more than Luo Fan could imagine. There were some who were weaker than him, but there were also many who were stronger than him. However, he had never seen a level 9 pseudo-sage suppress him with such an unbelievable advantage. This was the only thought in Zun Xing's mind right now. How can this person's treasure be so powerful? Moreover, he can actually use such a powerful magic weapon perfectly. But now, he still didn't acknowledge Luo Fan's strength. He didn't acknowledge that Luo Fan didn't need to rely on the heavenly cauldron of the divine court to have the power to fight against him. Luo Fan frowned when he saw Zun Xing struggling and refusing to speak. He let out a cold snort and lifted his hand. In an instant, the gray light from the heavenly cauldron shot out and landed with a loud bang, crushing a large part of Xing Zun's body into dust. His body then crumbled into pieces. After a long while, he relaxed the suppressive power a little, and Zun Xing's body reformed, as if he was on duty. This made Zun Xing truly understand Luo Fan's determination. He knew that the latter's patience had worn thin, and he was shocked. Even so, Zun Xing still gritted his teeth and refused to speak. When Luo Fan saw this, he sneered and waved his hand. In an instant, the power of the heavenly cauldron swept over, and the island that Xing Zun had put away instantly flew out of his grasp. It appeared directly in front of Luo Fan and was grasped in his hand. Zun Xing's expression changed when he saw Luo Fan grab the island. "Stop! Hurry up and release the spiritual cultivation island." Luo Fan held the island in one hand and observed it closely. "It seems that Taoist Zun Xing has always been the one making requests, and I have always been the one fulfilling them," he said faintly. "I wonder when Taoist Zun Xing will fulfill my request?" At this moment, the mini-island was already in chaos. The cultivators on the entire island seemed to be extremely busy. They were either looking for familiar Taoists or looking for ways to leave the island. When the island fell into Zun Xing's hands, the cultivators on the island were shocked, but they didn't panic. They knew Zun Xing's feelings for the island, and they knew that he would protect it no matter what. But now that the island had fallen into Luo Fan's hands, they couldn't stay calm anymore. They hadn't seen the entire conflict between Luo Fan and Zun Xing. At least, they hadn't seen what happened after Zun Xing grabbed them. But they weren't ordinary fools. How could they not see the destructive intent that Luo Fan had? How could they not see that Luo Fan really wanted to destroy the entire island? Unfortunately, no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't break through the island's defenses. However, they were unable to break through the island's defenses. This island could even defend against level 9 pseudo-sages, so how could they, who were not even level 9 pseudo-sages, break through it? Xing Zun looked at the island in Luo Fan's hand, and his expression kept changing. After a long while, only then did he say, "What do you want to know? Haven't I already asked my question?" Luo Fan was still circling the island as he said indifferently. Zun Xing paused for a moment before saying, "I don't have any schemes. I don't believe it." Of course, Xing Zun knew that Luo Fan wouldn't believe him, so he wasn't surprised to hear Luo Fan say those 3 words. Without any hesitation, he said, "I really don't have any schemes. However, I know what the other 9th level venerables are scheming." Luo Fan smiled faintly, obviously not believing that Zun Xing didn't have any ulterior motives. But that didn't stop him from listening. Zun Xing continued, "It's said that this time's Dao discussion conference, it might be the last Dao discussion conference in the world. That's because the 9th level venerable hosting the conference has already decided to attempt to break through to the Sage Realm for the last time after this Dao discussion conference." Luo Fan nodded, agreeing with the logic of Zun Xing's words. The 9th level pseudo-sage hosting the Dao discussion conference had grasped a total of 9 holy wills. In other words, he had already broken through to the Sage Realm from 9 different paths. This kind of resume was naturally glorious and shocking enough. But at the same time, it also meant that he was almost at the end. 9 was the extreme number. In cultivation, the number 9 usually represented the peak. For example, the steps below the Sage Realm were divided into 9 levels, and the Immortal Realm was also divided into 9 levels, etc. Therefore, the 9th level pseudo-sage, who had grasped 9 holy wills, could be said to have accumulated his preparations to the peak. If he were to attempt to break through to the Sage Realm, there were only 2 possibilities. Either he became a sage, or he died and his soul dissipated. It would no longer be like before, where he could grasp another holy will after failing to break through. Obviously, regardless of whether the 9th level pseudo-sage succeeded in breaking through to the Sage Realm or became a sage, it was impossible for him to continue hosting the Dao discussion conference. If he became a sage, what meaning would the Dao discussion conference have to him? Why would he waste his time hosting it? As for failing to break through, needless to say, he would have already died and his soul dissipated. How could he continue hosting the Dao discussion conference? Therefore, if the 9th level pseudo-sage really wanted to break through to the Sage Realm after this Dao discussion conference, then this Dao discussion conference would really be the last one. Luo Fan frowned and asked, "So what if it's the last Dao discussion conference?"